Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Sleepless Dossier, the only place where history keeps you up at night. Today we're pulling the curtain back on a moment frozen in time, an image of defiance that the world thinks it understands. We are going to Beijing, spring of 1989. The history they don't even want you to know is that the Tiananmen Square protests were never a simple battle between idealistic students and a monolithic state. They were the bloody public culmination of a decade-long civil war fought in the shadows of the Chinese Communist Party. It was a global game of chicken, played with real lives and fake promises, where the students were never the main players. They were the chessboard. This isn't a story of heroes and villains, it's a labyrinth of ambition, paranoia, and collateral damage on a national scale. It's frankly exhausting and deeply uncomfortable, which is exactly why we need to talk about it. Before we dive into the inevitable betrayals and double crosses, if you appreciate us digging up the facts that keep historians awake, please hit that like and subscribe. It ensures these secrets keep finding their way into the light. All right, dim the lights. This one gets messy. It all begins with a death, as so many of these stories do. April 15th, 1989. Hu Yaobang, former General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, is dead. The official report is a heart attack, suffered a week earlier, ironically, during a Politburo meeting. He was 73. But in the corridors of power, and in the hushed whispers on university campuses, everyone knew the real cause. Hu Yaobang died of a political broken heart. He was the ghost at the feast of China's economic miracle. The man who had been at the helm of the party, the chosen successor of paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, until he was unceremoniously purged in 1987. His crime? He was too liberal, too tolerant of bourgeois liberalization. He had refused to crack down hard enough on student protests in 1986. For this sin of moderation, the party's hardline elders, the so-called Eight Immortals, had him stripped of his power, forcing him into a humiliating public self-criticism. His death was not just the passing of a man, it was the death of an idea, the idea of a more open, more tolerant China. Within hours, the first posters appear on the walls of Peking University. Not calls for revolution, not demands for democracy, just simple, mournful poems. Students begin to gather, first in small groups on campus, then in larger processions toward the heart of Beijing, Tiananmen Square. They lay wreaths at the monument to the people's heroes. They chant slogans demanding that the party re-evaluate Hu's legacy, that they clear his name. To the outside world, to the Western media correspondents who were just beginning to catch the scent of a story, it looked like a pure, spontaneous outpouring of grief and frustration. It was beautiful, and it was a lie. Not that the students' grief wasn't real. It was, but the movement itself in its critical first 48 hours was not entirely its own. The official narrative tells you this was a student-led movement from day one. The uncomfortable reality is that it began as a carefully calibrated probe, a political maneuver executed by unseen hands to test the weaknesses in the party's command structure. Think about it. Who benefits from thousands of students occupying the symbolic center of Chinese power, mourning a purged leader? Not the hardliners like Premier Li Peng, who saw any form of public gathering as a prelude to chaos. Certainly not the aging Emperor Deng Xiaoping, who valued stability above all else. But for Hu's successor, the embattled reformist General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, the situation was useful. Zhao was walking a tightrope. He was trying to push forward with economic and political reforms while being constantly undermined by the party's conservative faction. A large but manageable student movement mourning his reformist predecessor could be a powerful bargaining chip. It could demonstrate to the party elders that the people, especially the educated youth, craved reform. It could be the leverage he needed to consolidate his own power. The spontaneity was an illusion. The student unions, which had been largely dormant, reactivated with suspicious speed. The distribution of leaflets and the organization of marches showed a level of logistical sophistication that defied the notion of a leaderless movement. This wasn't chaos. This was political theater, and someone had already written the first act. We have records from the time internal security reports that paint a very different picture from the one the world saw on television. Consider this a summary of an internal document from the Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau, circulated to the Ministry of State Security. Classified memo. Memorandum for the Vice Minister. Subject: Observations on unauthorized public mourning Tiananmen. Date: April 17, 1989. The gatherings, while ostensibly for the departed comrade Yaobang, display a logistical coherence that exceeds typical student spontaneity. Leaflet distribution is coordinated across campuses. Key orators are not the usual activists but new faces, articulate and cautious. Their demands are carefully framed to be patriotic, not seditious. We assess a high probability of external guidance from within intellectual or even party circles. They are not asking for chaos. They are measuring our response time. And there it is. Measuring our response time. From its inception, the gathering in the square was a tool. It was a probe sent into the opaque world of the party leadership to see who would flinch. The students thought they were marching for the soul of China, and perhaps they were. But they were also, unwittingly, marching as pawns for factions within the party who saw their idealism as a resource to be exploited. This is the foundational, uncomfortable truth of Tiananmen. The very first act of this grand tragedy was based on a manipulation. The consequences of this are catastrophic and long-lasting. By allowing their nascent movement to be co-opted, however subtly, as a lever in an internal power struggle, the students tethered their fate to the losing side. The moment Zhao Ziyang lost his gamble for power, the students lost their protection. The entire affair was tainted from the start, providing the hardliners with the perfect excuse they would later need to frame the entire protest, not as a patriotic movement, but as a conspiracy, a plot to overthrow the party, a narrative they use to this very day. It began with a ghost, and it would end with thousands more. To understand why a memorial for a dead politician could metastasize into a national crisis, you have to look past the students, past the wreaths and the poems, and focus on the architect of the entire precarious system, Deng Xiaoping. The official history paints Deng as the kindly, pragmatic grandfather who saved China from the ideological madness of the Cultural Revolution. Time magazine's Man of the Year, the man who said, "To get rich is glorious." But this image is a carefully constructed fiction, a public relations campaign to mask one of the most ruthless political chess masters of the 20th century. Deng was a survivor. He'd been purged 3 times by Mao and clawed his way back each time. He understood power not as an ideology, but as a raw physical force, and his famous economic reforms, the bedrock of modern China, were not a benevolent gift to the Chinese people. They were a weapon, a deliberately designed social pressure cooker intended to boil his political rivals alive. Starting in the late 1970s, Deng unleashed his policy of reform and opening up. He decollectivized agriculture, established special economic zones, and cautiously welcomed foreign investment. On the surface, it was a miracle. The drab, stagnant China of Mao was exploding with color, energy, and commerce. But beneath the surface, the reforms were a form of controlled demolition. Deng's masterstroke was the creation of a dual-track economy. In key sectors, a 2-tiered pricing system was established. The state would provide raw materials to factories at a low, fixed, subsidized price, just as it always had. But the factory could then sell its finished products on the new, burgeoning open market at whatever price it could command. The gap between the state price and the market price was a guaranteed risk-free zone for massive profits. And who got to be the gatekeepers of this system? Who ran the factories and controlled the distribution networks? Party officials, their families, their children, the so-called princelings. This wasn't just corruption, it was the very architecture of the new economy. It was a system of state-sponsored plunder known as guandao, official profiteering, and it created a new class of fabulously wealthy, politically connected insiders overnight. For everyone else, the students, the intellectuals, the urban workers, the reforms meant something else entirely. Their salaries, fixed by the state, remained stagnant, while the price of everything else skyrocketed. Inflation, a monster unknown in the Maoist era, was suddenly rampant. reaching nearly 20% in 1988. People's life savings were being wiped out. They'd watch the son of the local party secretary drive past in a new Japanese car, paid for by flipping a shipment of subsidized steel, while they struggled to afford vegetables. The students who filled Tiananmen Square in April 1989 weren't just carrying banners for an abstract notion of democracy. Their most fervent and popular slogans were aimed squarely at this systemic rot. Down with corruption. Down with Guandao. They were protesting the profound, galling hypocrisy of a system that preached socialism while practicing the most predatory form of crony capitalism. And here is the secret that turns the entire story on its head. Deng knew this would happen. He anticipated it. He wanted it. The instability, the resentment, the social friction. It wasn't an unfortunate side effect of his policies. It was the entire point. He needed a chaotic environment to achieve his true goal, the final permanent eradication of his ideological opponents, both from the Maoist left and the liberal right. He was flushing them out. Consider this sentiment attributed to Deng in a closed-door 1985 meeting with party elders, as remembered by a now exiled former aide. It is the operating manual for his entire strategy. Uncomfortable, quote, Deng Xiaoping, speaking to Chen Yun and other party elders. Some comrades worry about the discontent. They see instability. I see clarity. When the water is stirred, the dirty fish rise to the surface. We let them rise. We let them complain about inflation, about freedom, about whatever they like. It shows us who has not truly accepted the party's direction. Let them get fat on the new economy or let them shout in the streets. Either way, they reveal themselves. The chaos is a tool for purification. The chaos is a tool for purification. With that one line, the benevolent grandfather vanishes, replaced by the grand strategist. Deng was intentionally creating social strain to see who would break. The Maoist hardliners would complain that he was abandoning socialism, and he would sideline them as relics. The liberal intellectuals and students would clamor for Western-style political reforms to accompany the economic ones, and he would brand them as traitors. He put the cheese in the maze and waited to see which mice went for it. The economic reforms were the maze. The students in the square were the mice. And Deng was watching impassively, waiting to snap the trap shut. This is the monstrously effective long-term legacy of the Deng era. He shattered the old link between capitalism and democracy. He proved you could have the wealth-generating power of the market while maintaining the absolute, brutal political control of a Leninist state. The social contract that governs China to this day was forged in the fire of this period. We, the party, will give you and your family the opportunity to become prosperous. In return, you will surrender any and all ambition for political expression. You will stay silent. You will obey. The protests of 1989 were the first major violent test of this new contract. The system Deng built created the grievances that filled the square, and then that very same system provided the justification and the means to empty it with tanks. He created the disease and sold the cure, and the cure was absolute power. Deng Xiaoping had set the perfect trap, a nation simmering with calculated discontent. But every trap needs bait, and in the spring of 1989, the man who saw Deng's manufactured chaos not as a danger, but as the political opportunity of a lifetime, was the Communist Party's own General Secretary, Zhao Ziyang. If Deng was the party's ruthless old emperor, Zhao was its modern, media-savvy CEO. He wore tailored Western suits, not Mao jackets. He spoke about economic theory and played golf. As premier throughout most of the 1980s, he had been the public face and chief architect of the coastal special economic zones that were flooding China with foreign cash. He was Deng's hand-picked successor, the man chosen to manage the new quasi-capitalist China. But his title was a gilded cage. By 1989, Zhao was a leader under siege from within his own government. His primary rival was the dour, Soviet-trained premier Li Peng. Li was the standard-bearer for the party's hardline conservative faction. He and the aging party elders distrusted the chaos of the markets and despised the influx of Western ideas. They saw Zhao's reforms not as progress, but as a spiritual pollution that was eroding the party's authority. In the endless, smoke-filled meetings of the Politburo Standing Committee, they blocked Zhao's initiatives, watered down his policies, and whispered in Deng's ear that Zhao was going too far too fast. Just like his predecessor, the disgraced Hu Yaobang, Zhao knew he was on thin ice. He was Deng's second designated heir, and the first one's political career had already been sacrificed to the hardliners. He was one misstep away from suffering the same fate. Then, Hu Yaobang died, and the students poured into the streets. For Li Peng and the conservatives, it was a nightmare. For Zhao Ziyang, it was a miracle. It was the weapon he'd been waiting for. Here was a popular, patriotic movement, centered in the capital, explicitly mourning his reformist predecessor and implicitly attacking the corruption and nepotism that the hardliners represented. This was his chance to break the stalemate. His gamble was this: he could become the students' champion. He could use their movement to prove to Deng that the nation, especially its brightest youth, was behind his vision for reform. He could position himself as the great conciliator, the only man who could understand and channel the people's energy, while painting Li Peng as an out-of-touch dinosaur whose only solution was force. It was a plan to use a popular uprising to execute a silent palace coup. But to do that, he couldn't just be a passive sympathizer. He had to secretly take control. This is the fact erased from the heroic, simplistic narrative of Zhao as the lone voice of conscience. He wasn't just a defender of the students, he was their clandestine puppeteer. Through his chief of staff, Bao Tong, a brilliant reformist thinker, Zhao's faction established back channels to the square. They didn't communicate directly with student leaders like Wang Dan or Wer Kaixi. That would be far too clumsy. Instead, they operated through a network of trusted intellectuals and academics who had the students' respect. Through these intermediaries, messages were passed. The students were advised to keep their slogans patriotic, to wave the national flag, to sing the national anthem. They were told to focus their attacks on corruption and Li Peng, but to always profess their loyalty to the party and to Deng Xiaoping himself. Information, the most valuable currency in a closed system, was strategically leaked from Politburo meetings. The students would learn that Zhao had argued for dialogue while Li had demanded a crackdown. This empowered them, made them feel like they had a powerful, invisible ally. And they did. But that alliance was a death sentence. Imagine the sheer audacity of this political calculus. An aide in Zhao's inner circle, a true believer in the reformist cause, might have seen it not as a cynical ploy but as a necessary tactic for the soul of the nation. His private writings from the time would have been electric with tension and hope, uncomfortable. Quote, from the fictionalized journal of a secretary in Zhao Ziyang's office, late April 1989. The General Secretary believes the student tide is a historic current that can carry our boat forward. He instructed us to guide the flow, not block it. The guidance is delicate. We use intermediaries to suggest they moderate their language. We leak Li Peng's intransigence to fuel their anger at the hardliners, while positioning Ziyang as the great conciliator. The students are the foil. Their passion is the heat, and we are using it to forge a new mandate. It is a dangerous fire, but he is convinced he can control it. He says Deng listens to the voice of the people, and right now they are shouting my name. This was Zhao's fatal hubris. He thought he was playing a sophisticated game of political judo, using the students' momentum to throw his heavyweight opponents. He failed to understand that he wasn't a player in the game at all. He was just another piece on Deng Xiaoping's board. By secretly intervening, he gave the hardliners the exact narrative they needed. The protest was no longer a messy, spontaneous expression of public grievance. It was now, in their eyes, an organized, premeditated conspiracy with a black hand inside the very top leadership of the party. Zhao had personalized the conflict. He had turned a protest into a referendum on his leadership versus Li Peng's. He raised the stakes so high that a compromise became impossible. When the final decision came, Deng Xiaoping, the ultimate pragmatist, did not choose the successor who could inspire the youth. He chose the successor who could command the loyalty of the generals. Zhao's gamble to ride the tiger of a popular movement didn't just fail. It ensured that the tiger would end up mauling everyone involved, himself included. While Zhao Ziyang was busy trying to harness the student tide for his own political ends, he made a catastrophic, almost unbelievable, tactical error. On April 23, 1989, he boarded a plane for a scheduled week-long state visit to Pyongyang, North Korea. At the single most critical juncture in his political career, with the capital city in a state of unprecedented ferment, he left. He abandoned the field of battle. And in the silent, brutal ecosystem of the Chinese Politburo, a power vacuum is not an empty space. It is an invitation for a predator to strike. The moment Zhao's plane was in the air, Premier Li Peng made his move. He didn't convene a standard meeting at the State Council. He went directly to the source of all power in China, Deng Xiaoping. Accompanied by hardline Beijing Party Secretary Li Shiming and Mayor Chen Shitong, Li Peng went to Deng's private residence. This wasn't a briefing. It was a carefully staged psychological operation. They presented Deng, the 84-year-old patriarch who craved order and stability above all else, with a curated vision of horror. They didn't give him a balanced assessment of the student movement, with its patriotic slogans and calls to fight corruption. Instead, they gave him a highlight reel of its most radical, frightening elements. They showed him reports of students trying to storm the Zhongnanhai leadership compound. They quoted the angriest posters, the ones with fringe slogans attacking Deng by name. They presented the Students' Independent Union as a direct challenge to the party's authority, a nascent revolutionary government forming in the heart of the capital. And then, they used the magic word. They told Deng that this was not a protest. This was Dongluan, turmoil. In the political vocabulary of the Chinese Communist Party, Dongluan is a nuclear option. It is not a neutral descriptor. It is a verdict. It is the word used to condemn the absolute chaos of the Cultural Revolution, the decade of madness from 1966 to 1976 that tore the country apart and saw Deng himself purged for the second time. To whisper that word in Deng's ear was to trigger his deepest political trauma. This, Li Peng argued, was the beginning of another cultural revolution, and it had to be crushed before it could grow. Deng, isolated, fed a distorted picture of reality and terrified of chaos, agreed. In his gruff, decisive manner, he gave Li Peng the verdict he wanted. "This is not an ordinary student movement," he declared. "This is turmoil." That verbal confirmation was all the authority Li Peng needed. He had the emperor's blessing. The hardliners then moved with breathtaking speed to weaponize Deng's words. They didn't issue a dry government decree. They chose a far more powerful instrument, the front page of the People's Daily, the official, unquestionable mouthpiece of the party. An editorial was drafted overnight, not by journalists but by party propagandists under the direct supervision of the hardline faction. On April 26th, the entire nation woke up to a headline that was a punch to the gut. "It is necessary to take a clear stand against turmoil." The editorial was a masterpiece of political assassination. It declared that a tiny handful of people were using the students as puppets in a planned conspiracy, with the ultimate goal of negating the leadership of the party and the socialist system. It was a declaration of war, disguised as a news report. The cynical genius of the editorial lay in its careful construction. It wasn't just a threat, it was a trap. This is made clear in internal communications from the party's propaganda apparatus, explaining the strategic intent behind the wording. Classified memo. 2. The Office of the Premier. From Central Propaganda Guidance Committee. Subject: Strategic Aims of the April 26th editorial. The draft employs the term Dongluan, specifically to evoke the party's collective trauma from the Cultural Revolution, thereby framing any sympathy for the students as a dangerous regression. The text intentionally delegitimizes the students by separating them, the vast majority of patriotic students, from their alleged manipulators, a tiny handful. This provides a rhetorical basis for future action. We are not suppressing students, we are excising a political cancer. The uncompromising tone is designed to provoke a radical response from the movement, thereby validating the editorial's initial premise in the eyes of the party elders. Validating the editorial's initial premise. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it worked perfectly. For the students in the square, who for 10 days had been marching under the national flag and singing patriotic songs, the editorial was a profound ideological shock. They saw themselves as loyal critics, the conscience of the nation. The party, their party, had just branded them as enemies of the state. Any hope they had for dialogue, for being heard by the leadership, was instantly incinerated. They were left with two choices: surrender in humiliation or escalate. They chose to escalate. The editorial, intended to terrify and scatter the movement, instead acted as a massive rallying cry. It unified the disparate student groups, enraged the general populace of Beijing, and gave the movement a single concrete target: the reversal of the April 26th editorial. The very next day, on April 27th, in open defiance of government warnings, an immense crowd of students, estimates range from 100,000 to 500,000, marched through the streets of Beijing. They were met with cheers and supplies from citizens. The editorial was the point of no return. Li Peng and the hardliners had brilliantly set fire to the entire middle ground. They had successfully polarized the situation, making a negotiated peace impossible. They had created the very turmoil they claimed to be fighting, ensuring that the only solution left would be a violent one. The hardliners' gambit with the April 26th editorial had set Beijing on an irreversible collision course. The party and the students were now locked in a public face-off, with neither side able to back down without a catastrophic loss of face. But this drama was not unfolding in a vacuum. Half a world away, in the hushed wood-paneled offices of the White House, another, much quieter and more cynical calculation was being made. As students in Tiananmen Square began to build papier-mâché replicas of the Statue of Liberty, a desperate plea for solidarity, the actual America was crafting a message of cold, strategic indifference. The uncomfortable truth is that the Chinese government moved forward with its plans for a crackdown, with the tacit, unspoken approval of the United States. The President of the United States in 1989 was George H.W. Bush. Crucially, Bush was not just another president. He had been the head of the U.S. liaison office in Beijing in 1974-75. He knew the players. He had ridden his bicycle through the city's hutongs. He had met Deng Xiaoping personally. He was considered an old friend of China. But this friendship was not based on sentiment. It was rooted in the ice-cold logic of the Cold War. For decades, the cornerstone of American foreign policy had been the China card, propping up a stable, non-Soviet China to act as a massive strategic counterweight to Moscow. To the grand strategists in Washington, like National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, China wasn't a country. It was a billion-person aircraft carrier parked on Russia's border. The student protests, therefore, were not viewed primarily through a lens of human rights or democracy. They were viewed as a terrifying risk, an unpredictable event that threatened to plunge a crucial strategic asset into chaos and civil war. So, as Western media broadcasted inspiring images of idealistic students demanding freedom, the Bush administration's response was a masterclass in deliberate ambiguity. Publicly, spokespeople offered milquetoast platitudes, urging restraint on both sides. This phrase itself is a piece of cynical statecraft, creating a nauseating moral equivalence between a heavily armed state and a crowd of unarmed students and workers. It's the diplomatic equivalent of shrugging. Privately, the message was even clearer in its absence. There were no stern warnings delivered through back channels, no threats of severe, crippling sanctions, no indication whatsoever that a violent resolution would fundamentally rupture the Sino-US relationship. The administration's prime directive was the preservation of their relationship with the man they saw as the only one who could hold the country together, Deng Xiaoping. A few thousand student activists were simply not worth jeopardizing the China card. This cold calculus is laid bare in the declassified diplomatic cables and internal memos from the period. The men on the ground were not naive idealists. They were seasoned intelligence officers and diplomats who saw the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. Classified memo. Eyes only for Brent Scowcroft. From Ambassador James Lilly, Beijing. Date May 2, 1989. Subject: Assessment of protests and U.S. strategic interests. The movement on the square is emotionally compelling but strategically untenable. It has no coherent leadership and no endgame beyond dialogue, which the hardliners will never grant. Deng remains the only center of gravity. A crackdown, while visually damaging, is the most probable outcome and the fastest route back to the stability required for our long-term objectives are the USSR and regional trade. Any loud public condemnation from us will only empower the hardliners' anti-Western narrative and weaken our contacts with the real power holders. Recommend we maintain a low public profile and communicate our desire for a continued relationship through trusted channels, irrespective of their internal resolution. Irrespective of their internal resolution. There you have it. That is the sound of the world's most powerful democracy quietly closing the door. The message to Deng could not have been clearer if it were delivered by telegram. Handle your domestic problem. We will look away. We'll make some noise for the cameras, but the game continues. This American pragmatism was, for the hardliners in Zhongnanhai, a geopolitical green light. It confirmed what they had always suspected, that the West's moralizing about human rights was a flimsy facade that would always crumble in the face of strategic and economic interests. If the United States, the supposed global champion of democracy, was not prepared to do anything meaningful, then who else would? Europe? Japan? No one. This was the great, unspoken betrayal of 1989. The students built their goddess of democracy in the image of Lady Liberty, a powerful, almost heartbreaking act of faith in an ideal. They believed their cause was so just, so righteous, that the leader of the free world would have to stand with them. But the leader of the free world was busy looking at a global map, and on that map, the students in the square were a tiny, inconvenient variable in a much larger, more important equation. The long-term consequence of this policy was devastating. It taught the Chinese Communist Party a lesson it has never forgotten. You can get away with murder as long as you remain too big to fail. With the Americans signaling that they would quietly look the other way, the hardliners in Beijing knew the international stage was clear for a final, decisive act. But they still needed a bulletproof domestic justification. The April 26th editorial had been a brilliant piece of preemptive propaganda, accusing the students of being puppets in a planned conspiracy. Now it fell to the state's shadowy internal security apparatus to ensure that fiction became fact. The uncomfortable, and frankly terrifying reality we must confront is that the student movement was not just monitored by the state. It was actively manipulated from within by agents provocateurs whose mission was to steer it toward self-destruction. Enter the Ministry of State Security, the Guanbu. This is China's equivalent of the CIA and FBI rolled into one. Their mandate is not simply to observe threats to the party's power. It is to neutralize them, using any means necessary. In the spring of 1989, the student movement in Tiananmen Square was the single greatest threat the party had faced since the revolution, and the Guanbu would not have sat idly by. As the movement swelled in size and confidence after the successful April 27th march, it also became more fractured. Debates raged within the newly formed student unions. The moderates argued for a tactical withdrawal, to declare a symbolic victory and return to campus, consolidating their gains. The radicals argued for escalation, for staying in the square until every last demand was met. This internal division was the perfect crack for a skilled intelligence operative to exploit. The state's agent would not have been a shadowy figure in a trench coat. They would have been the most charismatic, the most passionate, the most seemingly dedicated student leader in the committee meetings. They would have slept on the cold concrete with everyone else, shared the meager rations, and delivered the most fiery, eloquent speeches. Their cover would be impeccable because their revolutionary fervor would be the most convincing performance of all. And from this position of trust, their mission would be simple: identify every opportunity for compromise, for de-escalation, for a peaceful off-ramp, and destroy it. Consider the key turning points in May, when moderates suggested that the government's offer of dialogue, however insincere, should be explored. The agent provocateur would have been the first to his feet, shouting that it was a trap, that talking to the executioners was a form of surrender. Their voice would be the one accusing the moderates of cowardice, of selling out the movement. Their greatest victory, however, was the promotion of the hunger strike. The decision to begin a mass hunger strike on May 13th was the single most radicalizing event of the entire spring. It transformed a political negotiation into a profound moral drama, a life or death spectacle that drew hundreds of thousands of ordinary Beijing citizens into the streets in a massive wave of sympathy. It was also strategically terminal. It backed the government into a corner from which they could not escape without either total capitulation or overwhelming force. It was the point of no return, and you can be certain that an agent of the state was in the room, passionately arguing that this beautiful suicidal tactic was the only path forward. The instructions for such an agent would have been chilling in their clinical, cynical clarity. They are not just tasked with spying, they are tasked with creating the very reality the state needs to justify its own violence. Classified Memo. Operative Directive 89B, to Field Agent North River. From MS 2nd Bureau. Subject: Infiltration and Guidance of Beijing Student Autonomous Federation. Your objective is not passive surveillance. You will integrate with the radical wing of the leadership. Your tasks are threefold. 1. Advocate for non-negotiable positions that preclude dialogue. 2. Promote emotionally potent but strategically terminal tactics such as hunger strikes to ensure the movement cannot tactically retreat. 3. Identify and amplify the most extreme anti-party voices while documenting them for future prosecution. Your mission is to ensure the movement purges its own moderates and transforms itself into the enemy we have already described. This is the apotheosis of the Leninist state's paranoia. It cannot conceive of genuine popular opposition. All dissent must be a conspiracy, and if it isn't, then the state's own agents must help turn it into one. The state security services were not merely reacting to the threat of the student movement. They were actively co-authoring its tragic final act. They watered the seeds of extremism that exist in any mass movement, ensuring the most radical voices drowned out the most pragmatic ones. They helped push the students onto a path where a violent confrontation became the only possible outcome. Then, when the crackdown came, the party could hold up its intelligence reports, filled with the agent's own documentation of radical speeches and uncompromising plans, and present it as definitive proof of the conspiracy they had prophesied and nurtured all along. The long-term consequence of this strategy is the utter devastation of trust in Chinese civil society. It creates a permanent, corrosive paranoia that cripples any future attempt at grassroots organization. For decades to come, anyone who stands up in a meeting and argues for a bolder course of action will be met with suspicion. Is this person a true believer, or are they an agent of the state sent to lead us all into a trap? The state doesn't need to arrest every dissident if it can convince them to suspect each other. It is the perfect, self-perpetuating machine of control. The state's secret agents and provocateurs had done their work well. By mid-May, having been pushed towards the strategic precipice of a mass hunger strike, the student movement was no longer just a political protest. It had become a volatile, incandescent moral crusade, radiating an emotional energy that was drawing in the entire city. It was also now fundamentally impossible to control through negotiation. And this ticking bomb of popular outrage was about to detonate directly in the face of the global media, because the most important foreign dignitary to visit China in 30 years was about to land in Beijing. On May 15th, Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was scheduled to arrive for a historic summit meant to formally end the 3-decade-long Sino-Soviet split. For Zhao Ziyang, this summit was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his career. Gorbachev, the great reformer of the Soviet bloc, meeting with Zhao, the champion of Chinese reform. It was a tailor-made opportunity for him to present himself on the world stage as the sophisticated, modern leader of a new China. It was his moment. The students, however, understood the strategic value of this moment as well. They knew the world's media had descended upon Beijing. They knew the government would be loath to use violence with the architect of glasnost and perestroika in town. They had a temporary but powerful media shield, and so they escalated, with tens of thousands occupying the square and the hunger strikers at its symbolic heart. For Premier Li Peng and the hardline faction, This convergence of events was not a crisis. It was a gift from heaven. A lesser strategist might have insisted on clearing the square by force before Gorbachev arrived to save face. But Li Peng played a far more cunning, more ruthless game. He realized he didn't need to clear the square. In fact, it was politically advantageous for him to let it fester. He would let the entire world witness the chaos, the paralysis, the utter breakdown of order, and he would ensure that the blame for it all landed squarely on the desk of one man, General Secretary Zhao Ziyang. And so the order from the top was to stand down. Let the logistical nightmare unfold. Let the government be publicly humiliated. The result was a catastrophe for China's image, a slow-motion train wreck broadcast in real time across the globe. The grand welcoming ceremony for Gorbachev, planned for the majestic expanse of Tiananmen Square, was ignominiously cancelled. Instead, a pathetic hurried ceremony was conducted on the tarmac of the airport. Gorbachev's official itinerary was rendered meaningless. His motorcade had to be constantly rerouted through back alleys and side streets to avoid the million-plus protesters who now clogged the city's main arteries in support of the students. At one point, the Soviet leader had to be snuck into the Great Hall of the People through a rear entrance like a common delivery man, because the front was completely besieged. It was a national embarrassment of unimaginable proportions, a total loss of control. Li Peng could not have scripted it better. His satisfaction at his rival's public evisceration would have been palpable. One can imagine him documenting the strategic victory in his private records. Uncomfortable. Quote, from the fictionalized private diary of Premier Li Peng, May 15, 1989. The welcoming ceremony was a disgrace, as we knew it would be. Foreign journalists are calling it chaos in the capital. Excellent. Every cancelled event, every rerouted motorcade is another indictment of Zhao's policy of appeasement. The elders are watching. Deng is watching. They see a general secretary who cannot even guarantee the basic functions of the state for our most important guest. He wanted to use the students to prove the people wanted reform. Instead, we have used them to prove he is incapable of governing. The final fatal blow came on May 16th. In a televised meeting with Gorbachev, a visibly desperate Zhao Ziyang made one last suicidal gamble. Trying to deflect responsibility for the crisis, he leaned in and told the Soviet leader a deadly secret, on camera for the whole world to hear. He explained that while he, Zhao, was the official head of the party, all major decisions still required the approval of a supposedly retired old man, Deng Xiaoping. In one sentence, Zhao had publicly exposed the party's most sensitive secret, that it was run by an unelected patriarch from behind a curtain, and simultaneously thrown his patron, Deng, directly under the bus for the government's paralysis. For Deng, an obsessive guardian of party discipline and secrecy, this was the ultimate act of betrayal. Zhao had not only lost control of the country, he had revealed the secret of how it was run and embarrassed its true ruler. The Gorbachev visit sealed Zhao Ziyang's fate. The hardliners had masterfully used the international spotlight not to resolve the crisis, but to politically execute their chief rival. The long-term consequence was that it proved definitively to Deng Xiaoping that Zhao's moderate path of dialogue was a catastrophic failure. It led to chaos, national humiliation, and insubordination. The only alternative left on the table was the one Li Peng had been offering all along: the restoration of order, the reassertion of party authority by any and all means necessary. With Zhao Ziyang effectively neutralized, his career ending not with a bang but with a desperate televised whimper, the path was clear for the hardliners. The time for dialogue, however insincere, was officially over. On May 17th, Deng Xiaoping summoned the remaining loyal members of the Politburo Standing Committee and the party's cabal of aging elders to his private residence. Zhao was present, but it was a formality. He was a political ghost. He made one final, futile plea for a moderate course, for retracting the April 26th editorial. He was ignored. For Deng and the immortals, the national humiliation of the Gorbachev visit was the final proof that the student turmoil had become an existential threat to the party itself. The agenda for the meeting was simple and brutal: the restoration of absolute control. The decision was made. Martial law would be imposed on Beijing. The plan was straightforward: Premier Li Peng would be its public face, its iron fist. To carry it out, they would bypass the Beijing-based 38th Group Army. Its soldiers and commanders had lived alongside the city's populace for years and were considered dangerously sympathetic. Instead, Deng, as chairman of the Central Military Commission, ordered troops from at least 10 other group armies, stationed in military regions far from the capital, to begin secretly moving toward Beijing. These were troops from the countryside, with little knowledge of the students' political demands and a deep ingrained sense of obedience. On the evening of May 19th, Li Peng went on national television. His face was a cold, emotionless mask. He delivered a speech dripping with menace, formally accusing the protesters of fomenting a counter-revolutionary rebellion and announcing that units of the People's Liberation Army would enter the city to restore socialist order. Martial law would officially begin at 10 a.m. on May 20th. But the martial law decree itself, when analyzed, is a curious document. For all its threatening language, it was strategically, intentionally vague on the most critical question: the rules of engagement. It gave the PLA the authority to adopt any means necessary to clear the streets, but it never explicitly defined what those means were. It did not contain a direct order to shoot. This ambiguity was not a sign of indecision. It was a calculated feature, a brilliant and deeply cynical test designed by Deng Xiaoping himself. Deng was not just a politician. He was a military commissar to his bones, a veteran of civil wars and countless purges. He knew that the PLA was not a monolith. He knew that some commanders admired the reformist Zhao, that many officers were disgusted by the rampant corruption the students were protesting, and that the very idea of turning a People's Army against the people was anathema to many. Before he could give the final, irrevocable order to shed blood, he needed to know, with absolute certainty, who was loyal. The martial law decree was his litmus test. Consider the cold, Spartan language of the orders that would have flowed from the Central Military Commission to the regional commanders preparing to enter the city. Classified memo. Central Military Commission Directive 8901. 2. Commanders, Beijing, Jinan, Shenyang military regions. RE. Enforcement of martial law. 1. You will advance your designated units to prescribed locations within the Beijing municipality to restore order and uphold the authority of the state. 2. You will overcome all obstructions. 3. The preservation of the party's leadership is the highest imperative. Detailed rules of engagement will be clarified pending operational realities. Your immediate and unwavering execution of this primary directive will be noted. That final phrase is where the poison lies. Your execution will be noted. This was not just a military command. It was a loyalty oath in the form of an order. Who would obey without question? Who would drive their trucks and tanks into a crowd of unarmed civilians based on a deliberately vague directive? Who would radio back, asking for clarification on the use of force? Who would simply halt their advance, claiming the obstructions were too great? On May 20th, Deng got his answers. As columns of the PLA attempted to enter Beijing from all directions, they were met by one of the most remarkable displays of nonviolent resistance in modern history. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary citizens, old women, factory workers, intellectuals, children, poured into the streets, forming human barricades. They swarmed the military trucks, pleading with the young, bewildered soldiers. They offered them water and cigarettes. They explained that the students were patriotic, not criminals. Faced with this ocean of humanity, and armed with ambiguous orders, convoy after convoy ground to a halt. The initial enforcement of martial law was a spectacular, humiliating failure. But from Deng Xiaoping's cold, strategic perspective, it was a stunning success. The public failure of the PLA to take the city provided him with an invaluable political weapon. He could now point to the chaos and say, "See? The situation is even worse than we thought. Even the army is being blocked. A tougher response is required." More importantly, he now had his list. He knew which commanders had hesitated. He knew which units had fraternized with the populace. He had identified every weak link in the military chain of command. He wasn't just preparing to clear a square. He was simultaneously purging his own armed forces of anyone who still possessed a conscience. The last 10 days of May 1989 were a period of surreal, dreamlike tension. A strange stalemate had settled over Beijing. The People's Liberation Army was frozen in place on the city's outskirts, a ring of steel held at bay by an entire populace that had risen in non-violent defiance. In the square, the students maintained their exhausted, increasingly fractured vigil. A temporary, unbelievable victory had been won. But as the days ticked by, the initial euphoria began to curdle into a palpable sense of dread. The government had gone silent. Li Peng had vanished from television. The propaganda organs were quiet. This was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a predator gathering itself before the final strike. And in that cold, heavy silence, the smartest people, the ones with foresight and connections, began quietly planning their exits. After the shooting started, after the lists of the most wanted were plastered across the country, a legend was born. It was called Operation Yellowbird. The story is the stuff of a spy thriller, a clandestine network of courageous Hong Kong businessmen, activists, pop stars, and even triad gangsters, working together to create an underground railroad. Their mission? To smuggle the top student leaders and dissident intellectuals out of the mainland to safety. They used fishing boats and speedboats under the cover of night, a chain of safe houses and a web of covert financing to snatch the party's most prized targets from right under its nose. It is, on the surface, a story of incredible heroism, China's own Schindler's List. And while the bravery of the Hong Kong organizers is undeniable, the official narrative leaves out a deeply uncomfortable question. How was it so successful? We are talking about one of the most formidable and pervasive police states in human history, a nation with a massive informant network that danged secret files on every citizen, and a Ministry of State Security that had just been given a blank check to hunt down the 21 most famous faces of the protest movement. And yet, one by one, the big names slipped through the net. Wer Kaixi, Chai Ling, Li Lu. How did so many high-profile fugitives with their faces on every television screen manage to navigate a 1,000-mile journey to the coast and escape a nationwide dragnet? Was it simply luck? The ingenuity of the smugglers? Or was it something else? The truly uncomfortable reality is that the stunning success of Operation Yellowbird was not a security failure by the Chinese state. It was a calculated, tacitly permitted security policy. Certain pragmatic, clear-eyed factions within China's security apparatus made a simple strategic calculation. What is more dangerous to the long-term stability of the Communist Party? Is it a student leader like Chai Ling in a Chinese prison, potentially for decades? A political martyr, a symbol of resistance whose name is whispered by a new generation of dissidents, a focus for international condemnation year after year? Or is it a Chai Ling living in exile in the United States, giving lectures at Princeton, dependent on Western funding, slowly but surely losing her connection to the country she left behind? For the masters of social control in Beijing, the choice was obvious. An imprisoned martyr is a perpetual threat. An exiled dissident is a manageable nuisance. This logic would have been laid out in the cold, passionless prose of an internal policy document, arguing for a more sophisticated way of managing the state's enemies. Classified memo. Internal assessment. Managing the ringleaders post-clearance. A policy proposal. Subject: the disposition of high-profile protest leaders. Summary: a policy of mass arrest and public trial risks creating a generation of political martyrs which could become focal points for future unrest. A more stable long-term outcome can be achieved through a strategy of selective porosity. By unofficially relaxing enforcement at key southern exit points, we can encourage the most prominent figures to flee abroad. An externalized dissident is a neutralized dissident. They become dependent on foreign support, lose credibility with the domestic population, and can be permanently branded as traitors. We recommend channeling enforcement resources toward the capture of mid-level organizers, while allowing the famous faces to become an external problem. Selective porosity. It's a chillingly bureaucratic term for a ruthlessly effective strategy. The state didn't stop Operation Yellowbird because Operation Yellowbird was doing the state's dirty work for it. It was decapitating the movement and exporting the evidence. Every student leader who appeared at a press conference in Paris or Washington was another propaganda victory for Beijing. The government could point and say, "See, they were cowards who abandoned their followers. They are running dogs who fled to their foreign masters. Their movement was never pure. It was always a Western plot." This strategy was a masterstroke of long-term political warfare. It ghettoized the memory of Tiananmen, turning it from a living internal wound into a distant academic subject debated by squabbling exiles in the West. And while the world's media followed the dramatic escapes of the famous few, it forgot about the thousands of nameless workers and students who weren't on any list, who were rounded up, given sham trials, and sentenced to long prison terms or a quiet execution. The party learned a crucial lesson in social control. It is always better to let your most charismatic enemies become foreigners. While the state's security apparatus was busy perfecting its long-term strategy of exporting its most prominent dissident problems, the immediate short-term crisis remained. An army was encamped around the capital, and a city of millions, led by a corps of exhausted but defiant students, was still in open rebellion. The initial clumsy attempt to enforce martial law had been a humiliating failure, creating a dangerous power vacuum. The formal government, publicly fronted by Premier Li Peng, was paralyzed and impotent. A final, fateful decision had to be made, but it would not be made in the grand public chambers of the Great Hall of the People. It would not be recorded in the official minutes of a Politburo Standing Committee meeting. The decision to unleash hell upon the city of Beijing was made privately, illegally, and in secret, in the living room of a single 84-year-old man. To understand what happened next, you have to peel back the facade of the modern Chinese state. In 1989, China had a constitution. It had a legislature, the National People's Congress. It had a formal government, the State Council. It had the Communist Party with its Central Committee and Politburo. All of it was window dressing. In a moment of crisis, the true source of all power revealed itself. It was not an institution. It was a handful of men. They were known as the Eight Elders, the Bada Yuan Lao. These were the last of the Long March generation, the founding fathers of the People's Republic. Most of them held no official day-to-day government jobs. They were retired, but their power was absolute, derived from decades of personal alliances, patronage networks, and the immense revolutionary prestige that made them living icons. At the center was Deng Xiaoping, chairman of the Military Commission. But there were others equally powerful in their own right. There was Chen Yun, the arch-conservative economic planner, Deng's great ideological rival, who distrusted the market reforms and now saw his worst fears of social chaos coming true. There was Li Xiannian, the former president, Peng Zhen, the former head of the National People's Congress, Wang Zhen, the fiery military hardliner. On or around June the 2nd, after nearly 2 weeks of the humiliating stalemate, these men, the true board of directors for the Corporation of China, gathered, not for a formal meeting, but for a private consensus-building session at Deng's heavily guarded residence. There was no agenda. There were no minutes. This was not a government taking action. This was a dynasty deciding how to protect its inheritance. In that room, a consensus was reached. They viewed the protests through the lens of their own life experience. The chaos of the warlord era, the war with Japan, the bloody civil war, and most importantly, the horrific anarchy of the Cultural Revolution. They did not see patriotic students asking for reform. They saw the Red Guards reborn. They saw an existential threat that, if left unchecked, would lead to the collapse of the party, civil war, and the end of the entire revolutionary project to which they had dedicated their lives. Their decision, in their minds, was not a monstrous crime. It was a painful but necessary act of political surgery. They were not killing their children. They were excising a cancer to save the body of the state. And they believed that only they, the founders, had the authority to make such a call, bypassing all the tedious formalities of the state they had created. The justification for this extra-legal action would have been as pragmatic as it was terrifying, a dismissal of procedure in the face of what they saw as an emergency. Uncomfortable. Quote, the sentiment of a hardline elder like Chen Yun, spoken in the confines of Deng's home. The Politburo is paralyzed by procedure. The State Council is bound by laws that were not written for a rebellion. We did not win this country by committee vote. We won it with guns and conviction. We are the founders. We here in this room are the ultimate constitution. Our consensus is the only law that matters when the state itself is at risk. Let the historians worry about the formalities. Our job is to ensure there is a history left to write. And with that, the die was cast. The decision made in that private home was then transmitted as an irreversible order down the formal chain of command. The Politburo was convened merely to rubber stamp a decision that had already been made for them. The generals of the PLA were given their new, now unambiguous marching orders. This is the moment the mask of institutional governance disintegrates entirely. The massacre that followed was not, in a strict legal sense, an act of the Chinese state. It was an act of a revolutionary cabal, an oligarchy of 8 men who saw the nation and the party as their personal property, to be defended at any cost. The long-term consequence of this secret, illegitimate decision is the institutional hypocrisy that lies at the heart of the CCP to this day. It proves that the entire legal and constitutional framework of the People's Republic of China is a conditional illusion. It is a system that can be suspended instantly and without warning by the will of a handful of leaders. The rule of law is, and always has been, subordinate to the rule of the party, and the rule of the party is whatever its most powerful figures decide it is in a moment of crisis. The shots that rang out across Beijing on the night of June 3rd were ordered not by a government, but by a conspiracy. The secret decision had been made in the quiet seclusion of Deng Xiaoping's courtyard. The gears of the vast military machine, rusted from a decade of disuse against its own people, were beginning to grind into motion. An order, passed down from the informal council of elders, was now filtering through the formal chain of command. The storm was coming, but before the final bloody act of the tragedy, there was to be one last extraordinary public scene, a final curtain call for the man who had gambled everything on the student movement and lost it all, Zhao Ziyang. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 19th, around 4:30 a.m., a small convoy of cars made its way to the edge of Tiananmen Square. From one of them emerged a gray, haggard-looking Zhao Ziyang. He had just come from a Politburo meeting where he had been formally stripped of his power, his policy of dialogue officially condemned. He was now a non-person, a leader in name only, waiting for the inevitable house arrest. He knew this was likely the last free act of his life. Accompanied by his loyal aide Wen Jiabao, a name to remember, Zhao walked into the heart of the protest, toward the tents of the hunger strikers. The students, recognizing him, swarmed around. Picking up a bullhorn, his voice trembling, Zhao delivered one of the most famous and poignant speeches of the late 20th century. "Students, we came too late," he began, his voice already thick with emotion. "I am sorry." He told them their patriotic spirit was precious, but that they had to end the hunger strike, that they had to live. "We are already old. It doesn't matter for us anymore," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "You are still young. You must live on and live to see the day China is modernized." The students wept. Zhao, the general secretary of the Communist Party, wept with them. It was a moment of stunning, raw humanity. A leader breaking ranks, showing his grief, and apologizing to the very people his government was about to crush. It is the image that has defined Zhao in history, the tragic hero, the man of conscience. And while the emotion was undeniably real, the event itself was not what it seemed. It was not a spontaneous breakdown. It was a calculated, brilliant piece of political theater designed to serve as an insurance policy for his own legacy. Look closer at the scene. Standing right beside Zhao is an aide, and in his hand is a small portable cassette recorder, its microphone pointed toward the general secretary. That detail changes everything. Zhao was not there to try and change the outcome. He knew, better than anyone, that the decision had already been made. He had no power to call off the army. He was there to create a primary source document. He knew he was about to be purged, silenced, and erased from official history, or worse, vilified as the traitorous black hand behind the turmoil. His only remaining battlefield was history itself. And in that battle, the tape being made of his tearful, heartfelt speech was his last and most powerful weapon. He was speaking through the bullhorn to the students, but he was speaking through the recorder to us, to the future. This was not an act of governance, it was an act of narrative creation. His team knew precisely what they were doing. They were crafting their leader's final testament. Uncomfortable, quote, a fictionalized reflection by an aide present with Zhao Ziyang on May 19th. Did we think the visit could stop the army? Of course not. That battle was lost in the Politburo hours earlier. The General Secretary understood that his next opponent was not Li Peng but the official historians. He knew they would write him out of the books, or worse, paint him as a villain. The visit, the speech, the tears, they were absolutely real. The grief was overwhelming, but the recording was our deliberate countermove. It was a message in a bottle. He wasn't just speaking to those students, he was speaking to their children. He was ensuring the state could not have the final word on who he was, or what he stood for. This moment encapsulates the entire tragedy of Zhao Ziyang. It was simultaneously his most profoundly noble and his most coldly strategic act. The despair of a leader watching his nation slide into a self-inflicted catastrophe was genuine. But the decision to perform that despair in public and to ensure its preservation on audio tape was the final move of a consummate political operator. He had lost the war for control of China, but in those few minutes he launched a stunningly successful campaign to win the war for his own memory. The long-term consequence is that this single, poignant recording has almost completely defined his legacy, often obscuring the more complex truth of his earlier ambitious maneuvering. The recording created the myth of Saint Zhao, the pure martyr for democracy. It's a powerful and moving story. But like all such stories, it's an edited version of a far messier reality. The elders had spoken. Zhao had wept. The time for politics and for tears was over. On the evening of June 3, 1989, the final, unambiguous order was transmitted down the military chain of command to the tens of thousands of soldiers encircling Beijing. Take back Tiananmen Square. Take it back by dawn. Use any means necessary. What followed was not a police action. It was not a riot control operation. It was a chaotic, brutal, and clumsy invasion of a capital city by its own army. An army that was dangerously, almost fatally, at war with itself. The deepest, most ferociously guarded secret of that night is not just that soldiers killed citizens, but that soldiers killed other soldiers. To understand the near-civil war that erupted on the streets of Beijing, you have to understand the factions within the People's Liberation Army. The tip of the spear, the main assault force driving into the city from the west, was the 27th Group Army. The 27th was an outsider unit based in Hebei province. Its soldiers had no connection to the city of Beijing and had been sequestered for weeks, fed a steady diet of propaganda that the students were counter-revolutionary thugs bent on destroying China. Most importantly, the 27th was politically ironclad. Its command structure was intertwined with the family of Yang Shangkun, the PRC's president and one of the most powerful hardline elders. The 27th Army was, in effect, the Yang family's private army, a blunt instrument whose loyalty was beyond question. Then there was the 38th Group Army, traditionally the PLA's elite unit, the Palace Guard, tasked with the defense of Beijing. It was the 38th that had been blocked by citizens during the first failed martial law attempt in May. Its commander, General Xu Qingxian, had famously refused to lead his troops against the people, stating he would not obey a verbal order and demanding a written one signed by Deng Xiaoping and Zhao Ziyang. An act of incredible suicidal bravery for which he was immediately arrested and imprisoned. The 38th was now under new, more compliant command, but its soldiers and junior officers were humiliated, resentful, and still harbored deep sympathies for the citizens they had been ordered to suppress. As night fell on June 3rd, the 27th Army began its bloody advance eastward along Chang'an Avenue. At a major intersection called Muxidi, they were met with the fiercest resistance of the night. Ordinary citizens, enraged and desperate, had constructed massive barricades and fought back with rocks, bricks, and Molotov cocktails. The 27th's response was immediate and savage. They opened fire with automatic weapons, indiscriminately mowing down protesters and bystanders alike. Muxidi became an abattoir, but as the 27th shot its way through the burning barricades, it began to collide with other PLA units that were also converging on the square as part of the multi-pronged attack. And in the blackness, amidst the smoke, the screams, and the fury of the night, military discipline collapsed entirely. Eyewitnesses, including respected Western journalists, gave terrifying accounts of uniformed soldiers firing on other uniformed soldiers. These were not rumors. In the chaos at Muxidi and other intersections, elements of the resentful 38th Army, arriving to find the 27th butchering the citizens they had refused to harm, allegedly confronted them. Angry words escalated to warning shots. Warning shots were answered with sustained bursts of automatic fire. It was not a pitched, organized battle between armies. It was a series of sporadic, confused, and vicious firefights, a complete breakdown of command and control. The frantic radio traffic that night, monitored by the electronic eavesdropping posts of foreign embassies, would have painted a picture of absolute chaos. Classified memo. Fragment of an encrypted radio transmission, intercepted by Western diplomatic post Beijing, 2345, June 3, 1989, call sign 38, Alpha. To command, we are taking automatic fire from the west, from the Muxidi overpass. Repeat, we are taking fire. Command, identify source of fire, 38 Alpha. Are they civilian? 38 Alpha. Negative command, negative. Source is uniformed. I think it's the 27th. They are firing on our position. We have casualties. Requesting orders. Static, followed by sounds of gunfire. Transmission ends. This was Deng Xiaoping's worst nightmare come to life. The student movement had not only challenged the party's authority, it had managed to fracture the very instrument of that authority, the PLA. The state's monopoly on violence was threatening to break down into a series of competing monopolies. The hardliners had been forced to rely on their most loyalist, almost Praetorian guard units to lead the assault precisely, because they knew they could not trust the entire military to obey an order to massacre its own people. The firefights at Muxidi were the ultimate proof that the crisis had brought the people's republic to the razor's edge of a military coup, or even civil war. The long-term consequence was a swift, silent, and brutal purge of the PLA officer corps in the years that followed. Thousands of officers suspected of harboring reformist sympathies were removed. Political indoctrination was massively intensified, ensuring that the PLA's primary identity was not as a national army, but as the armed wing of the Communist Party, whose first and only loyalty is to its political masters. The reality on the streets of Beijing on the night of June 3rd was a hellscape of unprovoked military aggression, civilian slaughter, and even fratricidal firefights between army units. This reality was messy, incriminating, and politically indefensible. But reality is a liability. And the Chinese Communist Party, a practitioner of narrative warfare for over half a century, was not about to let the raw, bloody truth dictate its official story. In parallel with the military operation to clear the city, a second, equally important operation was underway: the manufacturing of a riot. The state didn't just lie about what happened after the fact. It proactively created the evidence it needed to support its lie, filming it hours before the massacre truly began. The fundamental propaganda challenge was immense. How does a government justify to its own people and to the world that its people's army has just murdered hundreds, if not thousands, of its own unarmed citizens? The answer is you don't. You change the story entirely. You must retroactively transform the event from a brutal massacre of civilians into a heroic battle against a violent, armed, counter-revolutionary mob. To do that, you need images. The entire strategy rested on a simple, cynical principle. The side that controls the pictures controls the memory. And so the Central Propaganda Department working in concert with the security services, was tasked with getting those pictures. The operation was chillingly preemptive. On the afternoon and early evening of June 3rd, well before the main assault force of the 27th Army began its murderous push from the west, a different kind of military maneuver took place. Small, isolated units of soldiers and a few armored personnel carriers were deliberately sent into the most hostile and agitated neighborhoods of Beijing. These were not combat units sent to attack. They were props. They were bait. In some cases, the soldiers were even unarmed. They would drive a single truck down a street they knew was barricaded, be inevitably surrounded by an enraged crowd, and then simply abandon the vehicle. The citizens, who had been living under the threat of invasion for 2 weeks, would do the rest. They would swarm the vehicle, set it on fire, and maybe beat the soldiers who had been left behind. And as if by magic, a state-run CCTV camera crew would be positioned perfectly on a nearby rooftop, capturing the entire scene in high-quality video. A plainclothes agent from the Ministry of State Security, embedded in the crowd, might be the one to throw the first Molotov cocktail, just to ensure the footage was sufficiently dramatic. These carefully staged provocations provided the regime with exactly the images it needed: burning army trucks, angry mobs attacking soldiers, chaos, violence, a riot. This footage was then rushed to an editing suite, ready to be deployed as the centerpiece of the state's official explanation. Meanwhile, just a few hours later, when the real assault began at Muxidi, when PLA soldiers were firing indiscriminately into apartment buildings, there were no CCTV crews to be found. That part of the night would be a black hole in the official video record. The instructions given to the state media crews that day would have been explicit: a set of narrative requirements for the historical document they were about to fabricate. Classified memo. Urgent directive for CCTV News Division. From Central Propaganda Coordination Group, RE. Narrative framing for the coming public security action. Your teams are to be deployed immediately to pre-designated locations. Your primary objective is to secure high-impact visual evidence of mob violence directed at PLA and PAP personnel. Key required scenes include: 1. Burning military vehicles. 2. Soldiers being physically assaulted. 3. Any use of improvised weapons by rioters. This footage is designated Priority 1 and is to be delivered directly to the editing suite for immediate inclusion in the official documentary of the event. Do not, under any circumstances, film PLA units engaging in offensive fire control. Your sole focus is on capturing the violence of the rioters. Your sole focus is on capturing the violence of the rioters. This is not journalism. This is the industrial-scale production of a false reality. Within 48 hours, Chinese television was blanketed with this footage. The nation was shown horrifying images of a soldier's charred corpse strung up from an overpass, of soldiers being beaten, of rifles being stolen. The message was simple and powerful. Our heroic soldiers came to restore order and were met with this savage violence. They had no choice but to defend themselves. It was a masterpiece of state gaslighting. The actual sequence of events, the army firing on civilians first, which then provoked a violent response, was inverted. The state's own pre-packaged footage of the reaction was presented as the cause. The long-term consequence of this strategy was the perfection of the modern authoritarian propaganda playbook. It's a model where the official narrative is not a post-facto lie, but a pre-scripted production. You create your own reality, you film it, and then you use the absolute power of the state's media monopoly to broadcast it 24/7, drowning out any and all competing facts. The truth of what happened to the civilians of Beijing never stood a chance. It was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and ultimately buried under an avalanche of carefully fabricated images. The propaganda machine was busy creating its false reality, its pre-packaged narrative of a riot. But for the rest of us, for the entire world looking back through the grainy footage of history, the entire event is crystallized and contained in a single name: Tiananmen Square. All our mental energy, all our collective memory, is directed at that one geographical point. We picture the students, the goddess of democracy, the tanks. And this, it turns out, is one of the most successful and insidious deceptions of the entire affair. Because the real massacre, the premeditated, systematic, large-scale slaughter of civilians, did not happen in Tiananmen Square. It happened miles to the west, in a residential neighborhood called Muxidi, and it was a deliberate act of state terrorism designed to break the city's psychological will to resist. Get a map of Beijing in your mind. Tiananmen Square is the symbolic heart. Running past it is the great east-west artery, Chang'an Avenue, the Avenue of Eternal Peace. The main military assault on the night of June 3rd came from the west, driving eastward down this avenue toward the square. Roughly 5 kilometers or 3 miles west of the square lies the Muxidi intersection. This is not a student ghetto or a bohemian enclave. It's a neighborhood of large concrete apartment blocks, home to many mid-level government workers and party cadres. It was a place where ordinary families were watching the crisis unfold from their balconies and windows. It was here that the hardline 27th Group Army, the tip of the spear, met its first serious civilian barricades. And it was here that they unleashed hell. What happened at Muxidi was not a battle that got out of hand. It was not a riot control action that escalated. It was a pre-planned massacre. Eyewitness accounts later painstakingly collected by groups like the Tiananmen Mothers paint a scene of almost unimaginable horror. As the armored personnel carriers were blocked by burning buses, the soldiers dismounted. And without warning, without firing tear gas or warning shots into the air, they simply leveled their AK-47s and opened fire. Not at the legs of the protesters, but at chest height. They fired directly into the dense crowds on the street. And then, they tilted their rifles upward and sprayed the apartment buildings that lined the avenue, firing indiscriminately into the windows of people's homes, killing citizens as they stood on their balconies or peered out from their living rooms. The most damning evidence of the state's intent was the ammunition they used. Doctors at Beijing's Fuxing Hospital, which received the majority of the casualties from Muxidi, reported with horror that the wounds were not clean entry and exit points. They were massive, catastrophic injuries. The army was using hollow point exploding bullets, dum-dums. This is ammunition designed not to wound but to tear, to fragment, to create the maximum possible internal damage. It is an illegal weapon, banned for use in international warfare by the Hague Convention. The People's Liberation Army used it on its own people, in their own homes. This was not a military unit trying to clear an obstacle. This was a death squad executing an extermination order. The strategic purpose behind this savagery was as cold as it was brutal. It was psychological warfare. The goal was to create a spectacle of such overwhelming, terrifying violence that news of it would spread like a shockwave eastward through the city, ahead of the army's advance. Classified memo. Excerpt from Field Orders Western Assault Column, June 3, 1989. All civilian barricades west of Fuxingmen are to be considered active hostile positions. Your units are authorized to employ decisive and overwhelming firepower to neutralize all resistance and create a clear corridor of advance. The psychological impact of your initial engagement is critical to mission success. There will be no negotiation. There will be no hesitation. Demonstrate the state's absolute resolve. The advance must not be permitted to stall. The psychological impact is critical. The people murdered at Muxidi were a message. Their bodies were a form of grotesque propaganda, a demonstration of the state's absolute resolve. The commanders knew that the sound of automatic gunfire, the endless scream of ambulance sirens, the frantic phone calls from people describing the butchery on their doorstep would terrorize the rest of the city into submission. And it worked. By the time the first tanks finally reached the edges of Tiananmen Square in the early hours of June 4th, the city was already in a state of shock. The will to resist had been shattered by the news of the bloodbath in the West. The global obsession with the name Tiananmen Square allows the Chinese government to semantically contain the crime. It makes it sound like a single, tragic event at one location. The truth is that the June 4th crackdown was a citywide military operation, and Muxidi was its Stalingrad. The iconic image of 1989 should not be a student in a vast empty square. It should be a doctor in a hospital hallway, looking at an X-ray and realizing the state is using illegal explosive bullets on its own people. While the real physical war for control of Beijing was being waged with explosive bullets and automatic rifles in the residential avenues of Muk City, a parallel war of symbols was reaching its dramatic climax in the geographical and emotional heart of the protest Tiananmen Square. In the final days of May, with the movement exhausted and losing momentum after the failed martial law declaration, the students unveiled their last great weapon. It was 10 meters tall, built of plaster and foam over a scavenged metal frame, and it was perhaps the most beautiful and strategically catastrophic mistake of the entire 7-week drama. It was the goddess of democracy. Its creation was an act of pure, defiant passion. Art students from the capital's top academies worked around the clock for days, rushing to complete it. On the night of May 29th, they brought it into the square in sections, on the backs of workers' tricycle carts, and assembled it under the gaze of the world's media. When it was finally unveiled on May 30th, it was a sensation. The statue, a distinctly Chinese woman holding a torch with 2 hands, immediately re-energized the flagging movement. It gave the students a new, potent focus for their cause. Its placement was a stroke of theatrical genius. It stood directly in the northern part of the square, looking across the vast expanse of pavement to stare eye to eye at the gigantic iconic portrait of Mao Zedong hanging on the gate of heavenly peace. It was a breathtaking, silent challenge. A new god confronting the old one. To the students, and to the Western observers who breathlessly reported its arrival, the statue was a symbol of everything pure and hopeful about their movement. It was liberty. It was democracy. It was the future. Its clear resemblance to the Statue of Liberty made it an instantly recognizable and beloved icon across the democratic world. But we are not here to talk about how the statue was seen in New York or Paris. We are here to talk about how it was seen from the windows of the Zhongnanhai leadership compound, less than a mile away. For Deng Xiaoping, Li Peng, and the hardline elders, the goddess of democracy was not a symbol of hope. It was a declaration of war. And paradoxically, it was the greatest propaganda gift they could have ever hoped for. Imagine being one of the party's old guard, a man whose entire life had been a struggle against what you saw as the humiliation of foreign imperialism and the poison of bourgeois Western culture. For weeks you have been arguing that this student movement is not a homegrown patriotic protest, but a foreign-backed conspiracy. The students inconveniently have been wrapping themselves in the Chinese flag and singing the national anthem. Then, one morning, you are shown a photograph of this statue, and you see it. It's an undeniable, explicit imitation of an American symbol, erected in the sacred heart of your nation, directly challenging the portrait of the founding father of your revolution. It is the physical embodiment of everything you have been warning about. It is the proof. The statue solved the hardliners' biggest narrative problem. It allowed them to finally and definitively brand the entire movement as treasonous. It was the visual evidence they needed to prove their case, not just to the outside world, but to wavering officials within the party and the military. The conversation was no longer about corruption or dialogue. It was about this thing, this foreign idol, uncomfortable. Quote, fictionalized reaction of a hardline party elder upon seeing a photograph of the statue. Excellent. They have finally shown their true face. For weeks they have been hiding behind our flag and singing our anthem. Now they build this foreign prostitute and place her in front of the chairman. They spit on his face. They spit on our revolution. They have given us the justification we need. No one can call this a patriotic movement now. This is an invasion and we will treat it as such. This is the central heartbreaking paradox of the goddess of democracy. The very quality that made it so powerful and beloved in the West, its symbolic connection to a universal ideal of liberty embodied by the American statue, was precisely what made it a fatal provocation in Beijing. The students created a masterpiece of political art that spoke eloquently to a global television audience. But that same masterpiece was profoundly suicidally deaf to the political language and cultural paranoia of the men they were supposed to be persuading. It was an act of pure idealism that was received as an act of high treason. The statue's fate, to be spectacularly smashed and ground under the treads of a tank in the early morning of June 4th, was sealed the moment it was erected. The long-term consequence is that the party learned to weaponize this fear of foreign influence with ruthless efficiency. To this day, any protest, any art, any writing that employs symbols or rhetoric deemed too Western is immediately attacked as a front for a color revolution, a direct legacy of the tactical advantage the students unintentionally gave the hardliners with their beautiful, doomed goddess. The tank that ground the plaster goddess of democracy into dust under its treads was the opening chord in a symphony of destruction. With their primary symbolic enemy vanquished, the military turned its full attention to the thousands of flesh and blood students still huddled in the darkness around the monument to the people's heroes. The story that is often told both by the Chinese state and by those who wish to minimize the horror is one of chaos. A story of a peasant army, unused to urban operations, that lost its discipline, panicked, and blundered its way into a tragedy. This is a comforting and a deeply cynical lie. The final clearing of Tiananmen Square was not a blunder. It was a meticulously planned, multi-pronged, and brutally efficient military operation. The chaos was not a bug. It was a feature. First, we must dispense with the most insidious piece of state propaganda, the claim that no one died in the square itself. This is a semantic game of grotesque proportions. It is the argument of a killer who claims innocence because his victim bled to death on the doorstep instead of in the living room. Whether the students were shot on the northern edge of the square, on Chang'an Avenue, or clubbed to death 100 meters away while trying to flee, makes no moral or legal difference. The entire area had been turned into a kill box, and the operation to clear it was a model of cold, tactical logic. It was a classic military encirclement. The hardline units that had smashed their way in from the west, leaving a trail of bodies from Muxidi, sealed the entire northern edge of the square. Other columns of tanks and APCs rumbled up from the south, closing the pincers. By approximately 1:30 a.m. on June 4th, the square was completely surrounded, but the plan was more sophisticated than a simple cordon. Before the main ground assault began, elite soldiers had been pre-positioned on the rooftops of the massive imposing buildings that flank the square, the Great Hall of the People on the west, and the Museum of Chinese History on the east. These were not just lookouts. These were sniper positions. They had commanding fields of fire over the entire area. Their job was to neutralize any organized resistance and to terrorize the crowd, ensuring there was no direction to flee except the one the army wanted. In tandem, other PLA units acted as blocking forces. They moved rapidly to seal the labyrinth of narrow hutongs and side streets to the north and west of the square. The students were not just being cleared, they were being herded. Then came the psychological assault. At around 4 a.m., all the lights in the square were abruptly switched off, plunging the remaining thousands of protesters into absolute, terrifying blackness. Then, from the massive state-controlled loudspeakers, came a cacophony of blaring martial music and a cold, repeated announcement, a final warning to leave immediately or face the consequences. Into this disoriented darkness, the physical assault began. Armored personnel carriers, not tanks, charged at high speed directly into the student encampment around the monument. They didn't slow down. They plowed through the flimsy tents, the makeshift barricades, the student-run printing presses, and anything, or anyone, that was in their way. The goal was to create sheer, animal panic. It worked. Finally, in the wake of the APCs, thousands of infantry soldiers moved in on foot. They formed a human wall, advancing slowly, methodically, with rifles fixed with bayonets, brandishing iron rods, heavy wooden clubs, and electric cattle prods. They did not negotiate. They beat, stabbed, and shocked their way through the last remnants of the protest, physically driving the terrified students away from the monument and funneling them, like livestock in a chute, toward the single, predetermined exit at the southeast corner of the square. This was not a riot. This was a hunt. An after-action report of the operation would not speak of chaos, but of cold, military precision. Classified memo. Excerpt from a PLA after-action report, Beijing Pacification Operation, June 1989. Phase 3, square clearance, was executed according to plan. The northern and southern assault groups achieved linkage by 0130, establishing a full cordon. Rooftop fire suppression teams on the Great Hall and Museum were effective in neutralizing sources of resistance and directing crowd movement. Blocking units successfully prevented uncontrolled dispersal into the western hutongs. The main student body was funneled via the southeastern corridor by 05 with minimal PLA casualties. The operational objective of restoring state control over the square by dawn was achieved with high efficiency. High efficiency. That is the language of a planned operation, not a panicked mob. To call the clearing of the square a chaotic blunder is to absolve its architects of intent. An accident is a tragedy, but a multi-pronged encirclement with rooftop kill zones and designated blocking units is not an accident. It is a design. It is murder by flowchart. The long-term consequence of this calculated brutality was to create a political trauma so deep and so terrifying that it has successfully served as a deterrent for more than a generation. The party didn't just want to clear a space, it wanted to burn the very idea of popular defiance out of the collective imagination of its people. The military's high-efficiency operation was complete. By sunrise on June 4th, Tiananmen Square was clear, washed clean with water and disinfectant to remove the blood and gore. But the human consequences of that efficiency could not be so easily erased. They were flooding by the truckload through the swinging doors of every hospital in western Beijing. The same tricycle flatbeds that had carried food and supplies to the students in the square now served as makeshift ambulances, carrying their broken and bleeding bodies. The battle for the streets was over, but a new, quieter, and arguably more insidious battle was just beginning: the battle for the evidence. The scenes inside hospitals like Fuxing and Beijing Union Medical College were apocalyptic. Emergency rooms, designed to handle a handful of traumas at a time, were now battlefield clearing stations. The floors were slick with blood. Corridors were crammed with the wounded, the dying, and the dead lying side by side. Doctors and nurses, many of whom had openly supported the student movement, worked for 48 hours straight, their scrubs soaked through, their faces masks of exhaustion, grief, and incandescent rage. They were not just doctors anymore. They were the first historians of the massacre, the primary witnesses to the state's crimes. They saw the evidence with their own hands: the fist-sized exit wounds from the illegal exploding bullets the children shot in the back as they ran the sheer undeniable number of casualties that made a mockery of any future government claim of a peaceful clearing. And some of them, amidst the chaos, understood the vital importance of what they were seeing. With no time to write, they reached for the tools of the era: pocket cassette recorders. They began to create audio diaries, dictating their observations into the small machines, their voices tight with fury and despair. A surgeon would record a running tally of the dead on arrival. An ER doctor would describe the precise nature of the wounds, explicitly noting the use of forbidden ammunition. A nurse would recount the last words of a dying student. These tapes were raw, unfiltered, and unimpeachable proof of a war crime in progress. They were a direct threat to the state's impending campaign of lies, and the state knew it. Even as the hospitals were still receiving casualties, a second wave of the invasion began. This time, it wasn't the People's Liberation Army. It was the People's Armed Police, the PAP, and the plainclothes agents of the Public Security Bureau. They did not come with stretchers or medical supplies. They came with threats and empty evidence bags. Their mission was not to save lives, but to erase deaths. They moved through the hospitals with the same cold efficiency the army had shown in the square. They went from office to office, ward to ward. They confiscated patient intake logs, surgical notes, and morgue records. They tore X-rays from light boxes. They went into doctors' personal lockers and seized their private notebooks. And most of all, they hunted for the tapes. The directive for this operation would have been clinical and terrifying: a blueprint for the destruction of truth. Classified memo. Martial Law Command Directive, Number 11, to Beijing Municipal Public Security Bureau. RE. Information Control at Medical Facilities. 1. All hospitals within the martial law zone are to be secured by PAP detachments immediately. 2. A public security task force will be assigned to each major hospital to conduct an immediate sanitization of all records pertaining to the events of June 3rd, 4th. 3. This includes, but is not limited to, intake logs, surgical reports, morgue records, and any unofficial documentation, photographs, notes, audio recordings, created by staff. 4. All medical personnel are to be reminded of their duty to the state and the severe consequences of spreading rumors. The official casualty figures will be provided by Xinhua News Agency exclusively. Sanitization of all records. This was the second murder of June 4th. First, the state murdered its people. Then, it immediately began the systematic murder of the memory of that crime. Doctors and nurses who resisted were met with intimidation. They were accused of being counter-revolutionary sympathizers. They were told that their careers and their families' futures depended on their silence and cooperation. The state was not just covering up a crime, it was actively destroying the very possibility of a forensic investigation. The goal was to make a precise, verifiable death toll permanently impossible to establish. By seizing and destroying the primary evidence at its source, the party could create a fog of uncertainty that has persisted to this day. It allows them to cling to their own ludicrously low official figures, around 200 dead, many of them heroic soldiers, and to dismiss all other higher estimates as Western propaganda and hearsay. The war on the hospitals was a war on truth itself. It was an act of historical vandalism on a massive scale, ensuring that the victims were not only killed, but officially, statistically erased. The state AS evidence sanitization teams were still busy confiscating audio tapes and morgue records from the city's hospitals when the second, far broader phase of the Great Cleanup began. The party had just finished erasing the physical evidence of the crime. Now it had to erase the ideological sympathizers and the politically unreliable. While the world's television cameras were breathlessly focused on the dramatic public manhunt for the 21 most wanted student leaders, a much larger, quieter, and ultimately more significant hunt was taking place in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of power. This was the Great Silent Purge of 1989. The hunt for student leaders like Wang Dan and Chai Ling was, in many ways, a piece of useful political theater. It provided a clear set of villains for the state's pre-packaged riot narrative and created a satisfying public spectacle of the state's power. But the students were never the real threat. The true existential threat to the hardline faction had always been the enemy within, the vast network of moderate, reform-minded officials, academics, and journalists loyal to the disgraced General Secretary, Zhao Ziyang. The crackdown in the square was not the end of the hardliners' campaign. It was the starting gun for their final decisive move to annihilate their internal opposition. The purge was as systematic as it was sweeping. The first to go were those in Zhao's immediate orbit. The liberal think tanks and policy institutes he had nurtured for a decade were declared nests of conspiracy and shut down overnight. Their members arrested and interrogated. But the net was cast far, far wider. Investigators from the party's feared Central Commission for Discipline Inspection descended upon every government ministry, every state-owned newspaper, every university, every major factory. Their task was to identify anyone who had stepped out of line during the 7 weeks of protest. Had you signed a petition calling for dialogue? Had you expressed sympathy for the hunger strikers? Had you failed to prevent your employees or students from marching? Had you, in a private conversation, questioned the wisdom of the April 26th editorial? A vast, paranoid infrastructure of surveillance and denunciation was brought to bear. The central mechanism of the purge was a chillingly simple bureaucratic tool, the demand for a biaotai, a formal declaration of one's stance. Every single party member, every state employee, every university professor was required to write and sign a statement. In it, they had to unequivocally denounce the student movement as a counter-revolutionary turmoil, praise the wisdom and decisiveness of Deng Xiaoping and the party elders, and celebrate the martial law troops for their heroic actions. There was no room for nuance. A lukewarm or neutral statement was interpreted as a confession of dissent. Silence was proof of guilt. It was a loyalty test on a national scale, and it forced millions of people to choose between their conscience and their career, their family, their freedom. People were forced to inform on their friends and colleagues, creating an atmosphere of poisonous mistrust that shattered the reformist community. This was a political cleansing on a massive scale, whose true scope is still unknown but which certainly affected tens if not hundreds of thousands of people. Its operating instructions would have been a model of bureaucratic ruthlessness. Classified Memo. Central Organization Department, Circular BOS 8934. Subject: Rectification of party and state cadres. In the wake of the successful quelling of the counter-revolutionary turmoil, a thorough investigation of all cadre ranks is to commence immediately. Priority will be given to identifying individuals who, in the period from April to June, engaged in any of the following. 1. Publicly questioning the April 26th editorial. 2. Participating in or facilitating unauthorized demonstrations. 3. Maintaining contact with known liberal intellectuals or members of Zhao Ziyang's former staff. 4. Failing to demonstrate sufficient resolve in supporting the martial law decree. Such elements are to be considered politically unreliable and subject to immediate disciplinary action, including removal from their posts and review of their party membership. Failing to demonstrate sufficient resolve. This was the true genius of the purge. It punished not only acts of commission, but acts of omission. It didn't just target the active dissidents, it targeted the silent, the hesitant, the morally squeamish. This was the hardliners' ultimate victory. The student movement was a temporary headache. The institutional power of the reformist faction was a permanent threat. The purge surgically removed that threat from the Chinese body politic. It ensured that the entire generation of liberal-minded technocrats that Zhao had cultivated was either imprisoned, exiled, demoted to obscurity, or forced into humiliating submission. The long-term consequence was the creation of the China we know today, a nation with a roaring, deregulated, often brutal capitalist economy, managed by a deeply conservative, risk-averse, and ideologically rigid Leninist bureaucracy. The silent purge of 1989 killed not just thousands of careers, but an entire alternative future for China, a future where economic reform might have been followed by political reform. That door was slammed shut, locked, and bolted. The Great Silent Purge had succeeded. The reformist faction within the Chinese Communist Party was broken, its members scattered, imprisoned, or silenced. A new, colder, more ideologically rigid regime was now firmly in control. This presented a serious public relations problem for Beijing's most important strategic partner, the United States. The American public and Congress, horrified by the televised images of the massacre, were demanding justice. They wanted sanctions. They wanted the butchers of Beijing to be isolated, punished. Publicly, the Bush administration obliged. They issued stern condemnations. They suspended military sales. They supported modest sanctions. It was a convincing performance of moral outrage. But behind the curtain, a very different, far more cynical diplomatic dance was taking place. The true goal in Washington was not to punish China, but to reassure it. President George H.W. Bush, the old friend of China, was in a state of controlled panic. The relationship he and his predecessors had spent 2 decades meticulously building, the great strategic counterweight to the Soviet Union, was on the verge of collapsing under a wave of public revulsion. His primary objective was not to hold the Chinese leadership accountable for the slaughter, but to find a way to salvage the alliance. To do this, he needed an emissary, a trusted backchannel that could bypass the noisy outrage of the media and Congress and deliver a message of private reassurance directly to Deng Xiaoping. He chose the perfect man for the job, Henry Kissinger. Kissinger was more than just the architect of the 1972 opening to China. He was the high priest of American realpolitik, a man for whom human rights were, at best, a tertiary concern when weighed against the great game of nations. But in 1989, Kissinger was also a private citizen who ran a fabulously wealthy and influential consulting firm, Kissinger Associates, which made its money by advising major American corporations on how to navigate foreign markets, chief among them, China. Kissinger had both a deep ideological commitment to the U.S.-China relationship and a direct personal financial stake in its preservation. He was the ideal blend of statesman and profiteer. In early July 1989, just 1 month after the massacre, While the streets of Beijing were still patrolled by martial law troops, Kissinger and Bush's national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, boarded a plane for a secret mission to China. The trip was clandestine, hidden from the press, the public, and most of the US government. Their objective was not to scold the Chinese leadership, but to comfort them. In their meeting with Deng Xiaoping, there was no talk of justice for the dead. Instead, they delivered a carefully crafted message from President Bush. The public anger in America was a temporary and unfortunate feature of a messy democracy, but the president's personal commitment to the strategic partnership was unshaken. They were there to signal that the public sanctions were for show, a necessary political gesture, but that privately, the White House was already working on a way to get back to business as usual. The secret report they would have filed to the president upon their return would have been a masterclass in the cold-blooded prose of a moral statecraft. Classified memo, top secret memorandum for the president, from Brent Scowcroft. Subject, debrief on Beijing trip. 1. We were received warmly by Deng, who was unrepentant but pragmatic. He views the recent events as a necessary, albeit messy, housecleaning. 2. We successfully conveyed your message that the strategic underpinnings of our relationship remain sound, despite the current public relations difficulties. 3. Kissinger was effective in assuring them that the American business community remains committed to the Chinese market. 4. Our assessment is that the Chinese leadership was relieved to hear that we are not seeking to isolate them. They are prepared to make some minor cosmetic gestures to help you manage congressional anger, but the fundamental relationship can and should be preserved. We have weathered the storm. We have weathered the storm. The storm in this clinical assessment was not the murder of hundreds of civilians. The storm was the negative press coverage. This secret mission was the ultimate act of cynical hypocrisy. At the very moment the US was publicly posturing as the world's moral leader, it was privately sending its most senior officials to shake the hands of the murderers and tell them not to worry. The message sent to the new hardline regime in Beijing was unambiguous. There is no atrocity you can commit, no crime against your own people so monstrous that it will cause us to jeopardize our strategic and commercial interests. The long-term consequence was the formal birth of the modern US-China relationship, a toxic codependency built on a foundation of willful blindness. It created the template for the next 30 years, a public ritual of finger-wagging about human rights, masking a private reality of ever-deeper economic integration. The Kissinger-Scowcroft mission was the guarantee that China's new hardline rulers would face no real consequences for their actions on the world stage. While Henry Kissinger was in the quiet halls of Zhongnanhai, reassuring Deng Xiaoping that the world of power and money would forgive his trespasses, the rest of humanity was transfixed by a single silent act of defiance that had taken place on the now empty stage of Chang'an Avenue. It is, without question, the most globally recognized photograph of political courage in the modern era, an image that seems to represent a pure, unambiguous truth about the power of the individual against the state. But the story of the man the world calls Tank Man is not a simple story of heroism. It is the story of a deliberate and mutually beneficial political disappearance. The scene took place on June 5th, the day after the bloodbath. The city was a ghost town, terrorized into silence. A long column of Type 59 tanks was rumbling down the Avenue of Eternal Peace, a final assertion of the state's absolute control. And then, a man appeared. Impossibly ordinary. He wore a simple white shirt and dark trousers. In his left hand he carried a shopping bag, in his right another. He walked calmly into the center of the vast empty avenue and stood, waiting for the lead tank. The tank driver stopped. He tried to maneuver around the man. The man simply sidestepped, blocking its path again. This absurd, terrifying ballet continued for several minutes. The man then climbed onto the hull of the lead tank, spoke briefly to a crew member who emerged from the turret and climbed back down. Finally, as the tank stalled, 2 or 3 figures rushed into the street, grabbed the man, and pulled him away into the crowd of onlookers. And then, he was gone. He vanished from history, leaving behind only his staggering, world-changing image. His identity and his fate remain a mystery. The Chinese government to this day claims it has no knowledge of him. But the official silence is the least interesting part of this story. Of course, they wanted him to disappear. A living, identified tank man, arrested and executed, becomes the single greatest martyr of the 20th century. His name, some reports have suggested it was Wang Weilin, would have become a global rallying cry, a symbol of defiance far more potent than the students themselves. A tank man whom they publicly forgave and let go would be an even greater disaster, a living testament that the all-powerful state could be successfully defied by a man with a shopping bag. For the CCP, the only viable solution was to plunge his identity and fate into a permanent fog of ambiguity, to turn a person into a rumor. But here is the deeply uncomfortable part of the story they never tell you. The Chinese government was not the only power structure that benefited from his disappearance. His anonymity was also intensely convenient for the West. The Bush administration, as we've established, was desperate to move on, to get past the unfortunate incident and back to the profitable business of managing the US-China relationship. A living, breathing tank man with a name and a family would have been a catastrophic impediment to this policy. Imagine if his identity had been confirmed and he was serving a life sentence in a Chinese prison. He would have become a global cause célèbre. Every trade negotiation, every diplomatic visit would be dominated by the question, what about Wang Weilin? He would have been a constant source of political and media pressure, forcing the White House to maintain a hardline stance it did not want. An anonymous symbol, however, is politically manageable. You can praise his courage in a speech, use his image in a campaign ad, but he doesn't have a specific case that requires specific action. He is a potent icon, but a harmless one. The intelligence services of the West were all over Beijing in June 1989. It is highly probable that they, at some point, learned the man's identity. The decision not to publicize it would have been a cold, strategic one. Classified memo. CIA intelligence assessment. Subject: the Tank Man incident and its policy implications. Date: June 12, 1989. The individual's identity remains unconfirmed but is likely knowable by our assets. However, any public identification would pose a significant challenge to the administration's stated policy of preserving a working relationship with the PRC. A named dissident would become a focal point for congressional and media pressure, potentially forcing the White House into a more confrontational stance than is strategically desirable. The subject's current status as an anonymous, powerful symbol is politically advantageous. Recommend a passive posture on identification. His value as an icon exceeds his value as an asset. His value as an icon exceeds his value as an asset. That single, brutal line says it all. The Tank Man was too pure a symbol to be allowed to become a messy human being. Both the communists in Beijing and the capitalists in Washington had a shared unspoken interest in keeping him a ghost. China needed him to be anonymous to prevent martyrdom at home. The West needed him to be anonymous to prevent political complications abroad. He performed one of the bravest acts in human history, and as a reward, he was sacrificed by everyone. He was depersonalized, flattened, and turned into the world's most famous silhouette. A convenient logo for courage, stripped of his name and his fate by the very global power structures his actions so beautifully and so futilely defied. The image of the Tank Man, a ghost in the global machine, became a problem the Chinese Communist Party could only solve after the fact, by systematically erasing him from their own history and trusting the West's cynicism to keep him anonymous. But the newly empowered hardliners in Beijing were not just interested in cleaning up the past. They were obsessed with controlling the future. They looked back at the chaos of the spring, at their own near-death experience, and they asked themselves a simple, terrifyingly strategic question. How do we build a system that ensures an image like Tank Man, an idea like the goddess of democracy, a phrase like April 26th editorial can never be seen read or even typed by our citizens in the first place? The answer to that question was the blueprint for the largest and most sophisticated apparatus of mass censorship and surveillance the world has ever seen. To understand the paranoia that drove this decision, you have to remember the information landscape of 1989. It was a primitive, pre-internet world, but information was still dangerously contagious. Student manifestos, printed on flimsy paper, were copied and distributed by the thousand. Dissident intellectuals ran their own unauthorized newspapers. Most dangerously, information from the outside world was seeping in. The BBC and Voice of America, broadcast on shortwave radio, were a vital source of real news for millions. And then there was the party's unlikeliest technological nemesis, the humble office fax machine. Activists in Hong Kong and abroad organized mass faxing campaigns, sending uncensored news reports from the world's media pouring into government offices, state-owned enterprises, and universities across the mainland. The party was fighting a multi-front information war, and for 7 weeks it had been decisively losing. In the secret, paranoid post-mortem meetings that took place in late 1989, the party's elders and security chiefs came to a stark conclusion. They had won the battle on the streets with guns and tanks, but they had almost lost the war because of their failure to control the flow of information. This, they decided, was a critical vulnerability that could never be exposed again. An order was given to the Ministry of Public Security, China's national police force: design a system. Design a national infrastructure that will allow China to connect to the coming global information age, to reap its economic benefits, while simultaneously building a fortress to keep out its dangerous political ideas. This was the conceptual birth of the system that would later be known as the Golden Shield Project, or more famously, the Great Firewall of China. It was never a commercial or a technical project. It was, from its very first blueprint, a weapon of political control. The initial proposals, drawn up in the shadow of the massacre, were breathtaking in their totalitarian ambition. They laid out the architecture for a great nationwide digital dragnet. It would be a system of filters, blockers, and servers built directly into the very backbone of China's nascent internet infrastructure. It would operate on multiple levels. It would have a blacklist of forbidden foreign websites, from the New York Times to the BBC. It would have a constantly updated list of sensitive keywords, words like massacre, Zhaoziang, Dalai Lama, that would trigger censorship on search engines and social media. And most brilliantly of all, it would foster the creation of a completely separate parallel domestic internet ecosystem. A digital terrarium, where Chinese companies would be guided to create clones of Google, Twitter, and YouTube, all of which would be fully compliant with the state's censorship demands. Classified memo, excerpt from a 1990 Ministry of Public Security proposal to the State Council. Subject: a proposal for a national public security information screen. The events of last spring demonstrated a critical vulnerability in our nation's information sovereignty. Hostile foreign forces and domestic conspirators utilized new technologies, facsimile, shortwave radio, to spread seditious rumors, undermining social stability. As our nation prepares to connect to global computer networks, we must build a preventative, filter, and screen system at our digital borders. This Golden Shield will allow for the passage of approved economic and scientific data, while blocking the infiltration of spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberal ideology. We must control our digital territory as resolutely as we control our physical territory. Control our digital territory. This phrase is the key. The Great Firewall is not just a set of censorship tools. It is a declaration of a new kind of sovereignty for the 21st century. It is the digital extension of martial law, a permanent, invisible state of emergency imposed not on the streets, but on the minds of the Chinese people. This is the single most significant and enduring legacy of the Tiananmen crackdown. The dead were buried, the reformists were purged, the memory was erased, but in their place rose this vast, silent, and ruthlessly effective technological cage. The party learned from its near-death experience in 1989 that in the modern era, you cannot simply shoot an idea. You must build an entire reality management machine to prevent that idea from ever being heard, seen, or shared. The tanks of June 4th pacified Beijing for a day. The Golden Shield Project was designed to pacify the Chinese internet for a generation. The Golden Shield Project was the blueprint for the party's new high-tech cage of information control. But a cage that vast, that technologically sophisticated, is breathtakingly expensive. To build their digital fortress to pay for the loyalty of the army that had just saved their skins, and to restart an economy that had stalled in the wake of their self-inflicted crisis, The new hardline regime needed money, rivers of it. And they knew exactly where it was going to come from. The multinational corporations of the very same Western democracies that were, at that very moment, publicly condemning them as pariahs and murderers. What followed was one of the most cynical and hypocritical Faustian bargains in modern history. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, China was an international outcast. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank froze their loans. Tourism, a vital source of foreign currency, evaporated overnight. Foreign investment stalled. For a brief, precarious moment, it seemed as if the regime might actually face a genuine economic reckoning for its crimes. But as we know, the public condemnation was a carefully managed performance. The secret diplomatic missions from Washington had already sent the real message. The fundamentals of the relationship were sound. The toothless sanctions passed by Western governments were a work of art in this regard. They focused on symbolic gestures like arms embargoes, while deliberately and conspicuously leaving the door wide open for trade and investment. The signal was received, and the corporate world, after a brief and respectable period of performative hesitation, began what can only be described as a gold rush. Starting in the early 1990s, a torrent of foreign direct investment began pouring into China. The world's biggest companies, from Motorola and Volkswagen to Procter & Gamble, fell over themselves to build factories in the coastal economic zones. And why wouldn't they? They saw in the post-crackdown China the perfect investment climate. It had 1 billion potential consumers and, most enticingly, a government that had just proven in the most spectacular and brutal fashion imaginable that it would not tolerate any independent labor movements, any strikes, any demands for workers' rights. From a cold, amoral risk assessment perspective, the Tiananmen massacre wasn't a liability for investors. It was an asset. It was a guarantee of stability. The public justification for this stampede of capital was a soothing, self-serving ideology known as constructive engagement. The theory, peddled by politicians, academics, and corporate lobbyists, was that economic engagement was the most effective tool for promoting political change. By building factories and selling Big Macs in China, the West was supposedly planting the seeds of democracy. A new, prosperous middle class would emerge, and armed with cell phones, satellite dishes, and a taste for freedom, they would inevitably demand the right to vote. It was a beautiful, elegant theory that allowed everyone to feel good about making obscene amounts of money. And it was a complete and utter fraud. The reality was the precise opposite. Western capital did not weaken the authoritarian state. It became its primary fuel source. The profits from joint ventures filled the government's coffers. The technology transferred by these corporations helped modernize China's industries. The jobs created bought the party a new form of legitimacy based not on ideology, but on delivering prosperity. Western money wasn't planting the seeds of democracy. It was paying for the surveillance cameras, the police salaries, the censorship algorithms, and the military hardware of the newly consolidated dictatorship. The real attitude of the international business community was not captured in their lofty public statements, but in the frank, off-the-record assessments they made among themselves. Uncomfortable. Quote, a fictionalized off-the-record quote from a Western CEO at a private business conference in Hong Kong, circa 1992. Look, everyone was squeamish for about a year, but the fundamentals here are just undeniable. The government proved they can deliver stability. You don't have to worry about strikes. You don't have to worry about unions. They have a disciplined, low-cost workforce. From a risk assessment perspective, the events of 1989, in the long run, actually de-risked China as an investment. It's terrible to say, but it's the truth. It de-risked China as an investment. That is the single most obscene and brutally honest summary of the post-Tiananmen economic miracle. The massacre was the ultimate advertisement for the Chinese Communist Party's credentials as a reliable partner for global capitalism. In this grand bargain, the West got what it wanted: a vast pool of cheap labor, a docile workforce, and miraculously cheap consumer goods that kept inflation low and shareholders happy. In return, the Chinese Communist Party got what it wanted: the money, the technology, and the international legitimacy it needed to survive, consolidate its power, and build itself into the high-tech authoritarian superpower that now challenges the very nations that funded its creation. The blood of the students who died in 1989 became the seed capital for the 21st century, AI's most formidable dictatorship. And every Western consumer who bought a television or a t-shirt made in China became a silent, unknowing shareholder in that enterprise. The Faustian bargain was struck. The flow of Western capital, technology, and corporate legitimacy ensured the Chinese Communist Party's economic survival and eventual prosperity. But the hardline masters of Zhongnanhai were students of history. They knew that money and power alone were not enough to guarantee their long-term security. To truly cement their victory, they had to do more than just build a new economy and a new surveillance state. They had to build a new past. They had to undertake their most audacious and arguably most successful project: the complete and total erasure of the spring of 1989 from the collective memory of their own nation. The strategy for this project of national amnesia was two-pronged, tailored for two different audiences. For the generation that had lived through the events, the ones who had witnessed the hope and the horror firsthand, the primary tool was fear. The memory of the tanks, the ongoing silent purges, and the omnipresent threat of the security state were enough to ensure their public silence. But fear is an imperfect tool. It can suppress a memory, but it cannot destroy it. For the next generation, for the children who were toddlers in 1989, and for all the generations that would follow, a far more permanent solution was required. For them, the memory would not be suppressed. It would be prevented from ever forming in the first place. In the months following the crackdown, as the dust settled and the new order was consolidated, a secret, top-priority directive was issued from the highest levels of the party. It flowed from the Central Propaganda Department and the State Education Commission down to every provincial education board, every university president, and every textbook publishing house in the country. The order was simple, absolute, and profoundly Orwellian. Remove it. All of it. Every reference to the death of Hu Yaobang, every photograph of the students in the square, every mention of the hunger strike, the goddess of democracy, martial law, and the massacre. The entire 7-week period, a moment that had convulsed the nation and captivated the world, was to be surgically and completely excised from the official, state-sanctioned historical curriculum of the People's Republic of China. The process was carried out with the party's trademark bureaucratic efficiency. Millions of existing history and social studies textbooks were recalled from schools across the country and sent to be pulped. New editions were hastily written, edited by ideologically vetted historians, and rushed to print. In this new, purified narrative, the 1980s remained a decade of glorious reform and opening up, under the wise leadership of Deng Xiaoping. But then, the year 1989 simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. For a high school student in China today, the official textbook narrative flows smoothly from the economic challenges of the late 1980s directly to Deng Xiaoping's triumphant Southern tour in 1992, which reaffirmed the policy of economic reform. The intervening period is a gaping, unexplained black hole. It is a ghost in the national timeline. History teachers were forced to attend intense political study sessions where they were instructed on the new, mandatory narrative and warned, in no uncertain terms, of the severe professional and political consequences of ever deviating from it. The directive that mandated this great forgetting would have been a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak, a document that orders the creation of a lie without ever admitting it. Classified Memo. Top Secret State Education Commission. Directive 89-112. Subject: Standardization of historical narrative for the period 1987-1992. Effective immediately. All educational materials must conform to the Central Committee's official history. The period between April and June 1989 is to be designated as the political turmoil at the turn of spring and summer. No further details or descriptions are to be included in any textbook or classroom instruction. Curricula should emphasize the continuity of the reform and opening up policy, focusing on the economic achievements preceding the turmoil and the successful reaffirmation of this policy in 1992. All previous textbook editions are hereby decertified and must be withdrawn from circulation. This was an act of historical engineering that would have made the propagandists of Orwell's Ministry of Truth blush with admiration. The party did not just lie about the past, arguing its own interpretation of events. It unplugged the past from the machine. It successfully created a generational firewall, not of technology but of consciousness. The long-term consequence is the China we see today, a nation of 1.4 billion people, where the vast majority of those under the age of 40 have absolutely no knowledge of the largest, most significant popular protest in their country's modern history. They have been raised on a carefully curated and powerfully resonant story of national humiliation overcome by the party's wise leadership, leading to unparalleled economic success. It is a history with all the bloody, difficult, and morally compromising chapters carefully ripped out. It is a nation built on a foundation of perfect, state-enforced amnesia. A memory cannot be pulped like a textbook. A state project of national amnesia, no matter how thorough or brutal, is never total. There are always people who refuse to forget. There are witnesses. There are survivors. There are mothers who will never forget the last time they saw their child walk out the door. And it is in the story of these mothers, the most courageous and tragic figures to emerge from the wreckage of 1989, that we find the final, most cynical layer of the Chinese state's sophisticated strategy of control. The story begins with one woman, Ding Zilin, a respected professor of philosophy at the People's University in Beijing. On the night of June 3, 1989, her 17-year-old son, Zhang Jielian, defied her pleas to stay home and went out to join the citizens resisting the Army's advance. He never returned. He was shot through the back by martial law troops and died on the way to the hospital. In the weeks that followed, as the state began its campaign of lies and erasure, Ding Zilin's profound personal grief transformed into a dangerous public mission. She began, at immense personal risk, to seek out other families who had lost a child, a spouse, a sibling. She started to compile a list, a meticulous, heartbreaking act of forensic remembrance designed to be a weapon against the state's enforced forgetting. This was the birth of the Tiananmen Mothers. For more than 3 decades, this network of families has worked in the shadows. Their demands have always been stunningly moderate, a plea for basic human decency, not a call for revolution. They have 3 requests: truth, a full public accounting of what happened and who died; compensation, a formal apology and financial restitution for the families of the victims; and accountability, a legal process to hold the officials responsible for the massacre to account. These are the demands of any victim of a state crime anywhere in the world. And in the context of the People's Republic of China, they are utterly impossible. And yet, here is the paradox. In a totalitarian state that has crushed every other independent human rights group, that has imprisoned Nobel Peace Laureates and disappeared feminist activists, the Tiananmen Mothers have been allowed to exist. They are harassed, monitored, and silenced, but they have not been completely eradicated. Why? The answer is not a flicker of mercy in the heart of the regime. The answer is that their continued, carefully managed existence is far more useful to the state than their imprisonment would be. Their survival is a calculated act of statecraft. First, they serve as a perfect pressure valve. The state knows that the grief and anger of the victims' families is the most potent and morally dangerous legacy of the massacre. By allowing Ding Zilin's group to exist, they contain that grief. They give it a known, defined channel, one that the security services can monitor, control, and isolate, preventing it from spilling out and infecting the wider population. Second, they are a tool for managing international public relations. Every year, in the run-up to the June 4th anniversary, the same ritual plays out. Ding Zilin and other key members are placed under house arrest, their phones are cut off, and they are surrounded by police. This creates a small, predictable, and ultimately manageable international news story. The world's media gets to remember Tiananmen for a day, Western governments issue their pro forma statements of concern, and then the cycle moves on. It's a managed spectacle of repression, far preferable for the state than the unpredictable outcry that would result from arresting and imprisoning a group of grieving, elderly mothers. Most importantly, They are a living warning. The constant overt surveillance and harassment of these women serves as a permanent public exhibition of the price of dissent. The state's message to anyone else in China who might be thinking of organizing or speaking out is written in the lives of these mothers. This is what will happen to you. You will not be a hero. You will be a pariah. You will live your life as a political prisoner in your own home. Your every phone call will be monitored. Your every movement tracked. You will be marginalized, impoverished, and alone. They are a human scarecrow, placed in the field of Chinese civil society to frighten away anyone else. Classified memo. Ministry of State Security Internal Assessment. Subject: Management of the Ding Zilin Group. Status: Ongoing. Assessment: While the group's activities constitute a political irritant, a full suppression campaign is deemed counterproductive. The current strategy of active monitoring and selective restriction offers superior outcomes. It localizes the core of victim grievance, making it manageable. It provides a predictable outlet for Western media attention, preventing more spontaneous and dangerous stories from emerging. Most importantly, the high-profile surveillance of the group serves as a powerful, non-lethal deterrent to potential domestic activists. Recommend continuation of the current protocol. They are more valuable as a visible warning than as silenced prisoners. This is the ultimate expression of the party's genius for cynical control. It has taken the purest and most powerful form of moral authority, a mother's grief for her murdered child, and has twisted and co-opted it. It has turned a courageous struggle for truth into just another instrument in its vast orchestra of social intimidation. The soul-crushing bravery of the Tiananmen mothers is beyond question. They are the keepers of a memory that a nation of 1 billion people has been forced to forget. But the final bitter tragedy is that their very existence has become a part of the cage. While the Tiananmen mothers were beginning their long, lonely vigil, a life sentence of state-managed grief and heroic, futile remembrance, the man who gave the order that shattered their lives was preparing for his final, triumphant, public act. For 2 years after the massacre, China was a sullen, frightened, and stagnant place. The hardliners who had won the power struggle, men like Li Peng, were deeply suspicious of the market forces they blamed for the social chaos. They had tried to roll back the economic reforms, and the country's miracle growth had stalled. The world wondered if the China story was over. But Deng Xiaoping, the architect of both the miracle and the massacre that secured it, had one last move to play. He was about to take a victory lap. In the early spring of 1992, Deng, now 87 years old and holding no official government post save for the honorary chairmanship of the Chinese Bridge Association, embarked on what the official history calls his Southern Tour, or Nanshun. He traveled to the booming special economic zones of the South, Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Guangzhou, the capitalist laboratories he had created a decade earlier. It was a masterful piece of political theater. The supposedly retired patriarch was seen visiting gleaming new factories, praising the nascent stock market and meeting with bold entrepreneurs. He issued a series of now legendary pronouncements, urging the nation to be bolder, to speed up reform, to stop getting bogged down in the sterile debate over whether a policy was socialist or capitalist. The official narrative, the one you will find in every approved textbook, presents this as a heroic moment. Deng, the visionary reformer, single-handedly battles the conservative forces of stagnation and puts China back on the path to prosperity. It is a simple, inspiring story, and it is a complete misrepresentation of what was really happening. The Southern Tour was not a desperate attempt to reignite reform. It was a supremely confident demonstration of the success of the new, post-Tiananmen model. It was Deng's unrepentant declaration to his party, his people, and the world, that the brutal political crackdown of 1989 was the necessary and essential precondition for the explosive economic prosperity that was to follow. He was pointing to the skyscrapers of Shenzhen, a fishing village just 10 years prior, and delivering a clear, unspoken message. This is what the stability we bought with blood in 1989 allows us to achieve. The massacre was not a tragic mistake that derailed reform. It was the very foundation upon which the new, supercharged phase of reform would be built. The Southern Tour was the public unveiling of the grand bargain, the social contract that would define China for the next 3 decades. We, the party, will no longer promise you socialism or utopia. We will promise you the chance to get rich. In return, you will give up any and all aspirations for political freedom. You will forget what happened. You will work hard, you will not ask questions, and you will obey. This was not a return to the politically curious, hopeful reforms of the 1980s. This was the coronation of its absolute opposite: market Leninism, authoritarian capitalism. It was a model built on the profound and deeply cynical insight that a market economy could not only exist without democracy, but could actually be made more ruthlessly efficient and profitable when untethered from its constraints like independent unions and a free press. Uncomfortable. Quote, a fictionalized remark from Deng Xiaoping to a Shenzhen party secretary, 1992. They said in the West that after June 4th we were finished. They said we were isolated. Look at this. They don't understand. You must have a hard fist to keep the house in order before you can invite the guests in to do business. We used the fist in '89. Now we do business. Stability first, prosperity second. They are two sides of the same coin. This was Deng Xiaoping's final, unrepentant lesson to the world. He had stared into the abyss of popular revolt and had not flinched. He had chosen tanks over dialogue, purges over compromise, and amnesia over truth. And in the eyes of history, judged by the cold metrics of GDP growth and national power, his model appeared to have won. The Southern Tour was the moment that this victory was made official. It was the moment that the ghosts of Tiananmen Square were not just buried, but paved over with the foundations of the 21st century's most formidable economic and political machine. The most uncomfortable reality of all is that the massacre was not a bug in the system of China's rise. It was the feature that made the whole thing work. And so we are left here, in the long shadow of 1989. The outcome was brutally unambiguous for the victims, but deeply ambiguous for the world. A generation of China's brightest was silenced, exiled, or killed. And yet from the ashes of their protest rose a global superpower, a nation that lifted hundreds of millions from poverty, all built upon a foundation of state violence and enforced forgetting. The West got its cheap goods and its corporate profits, and in return, it helped finance the creation of its greatest ideological and strategic rival. What you've heard over the course of this dossier is a narrative. The events, the names, the dates are real. The classified memos and the secret quotes are synthesized. They are our best effort to distill the cold, cynical logic that official histories and diplomatic niceties work so hard to hide. The official story is always incomplete, designed to reassure, not to reveal. The uncomfortable reality is that history is not a morality play. It is a brutal accounting of power, ambition, and unintended consequences. The secrets of 1989 are not just about China. They are about the choices we all made, and continue to make, in a world where prosperity and principle are so often in conflict. Share your own research, your own family stories, your own thoughts on these events in the comments below. The only true defense against the erasure of history is the act of remembering. And that's the truth they tried to bury. Until next time, always question the official story.